Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The quiet contagion, the smell of ozone. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My world began to unravel with a smell. It wasn't the sulfurous belch of the Tijuana River estuary on a hot day, or the briny tang of the Pacific that clung to everything in our corner of San Diego County. This was different. It was clean, sharp, and utterly synthetic. The smell of a lightning strike, trapped in a bottle. The smell of a dying television set. The precise, anxious scent of ozone. I first noticed it on my afternoon walk, a ritual I'd adopted to decompress from the silent intensity of my job. As an electrical engineer specializing in radio frequency systems, I worked from a home office I'd converted from a spare bedroom. My days were spent in a monk-like communion with schematics, spectrum analyzers, and the quiet hum of my server rack. My world was one of precise frequencies and predictable behavior. Or it had been. The smell hit me at the corner of Oakhaven Drive and Cypress Lane, a stretch of manicured lawns and identical beige houses baking under the relentless California sun. It was a localized cloud, so distinct I stopped walking, sniffing the air like a bloodhound. I looked around for the source. A downed power line. A blown transformer on a utility pole. Nothing. Just a sprinkler system hissing rhythmically against a perfectly green lawn. Mrs. Gable, my elderly neighbor from across the street, was tending to her prize-winning roses, her wide-brimmed hat a bobbing circle of straw. I walked on, and 50 feet later, the smell was gone, replaced by the cloying sweetness of Mrs. Gable's roses. I dismissed it. An atmospheric anomaly. A phantom scent triggered by stress. My last project, a custom RF filter for a defense contractor, had been a nightmare of crosstalk and signal leakage. My brain was probably just short-circuiting. A few days later, the sound started. I was in the laundry room, a small, windowless space off the garage. The washing machine, a high-efficiency model I'd bought for its quiet operation, was in its spin cycle. It had a little electronic chime to signal the end of a cycle, a cheerful, ascending three-note tune, do-re-mi. I'd heard it 1,000 times. But on this day, as the cycle wound down, the machine played a different tune. Mi-re-do. The same notes, but in reverse. I froze, laundry basket in hand. That wasn't right. It was a pre-programmed sound, embedded in a ROM chip. It couldn't just reverse itself. It was like hearing a bird sing its song backwards. I waited for the next load, my ear pressed against the cool metal of the machine. An hour later, it chimed again. Do-re-mi, normal. You're losing it, Alex, I muttered to myself, stacking the damp clothes into the dryer. It had to be auditory pareidolia, the brain finding patterns in random noise. The hum of the machine, the sloshing of the water. I'd simply misheard it. Yet, the certainty of what I'd heard lingered, a dissonant chord in the quiet symphony of my home. The incidents remained isolated, easily walled off by logic and self-reproach. A flicker in my peripheral vision that seemed to resolve into an impossible geometric shape before vanishing. The taste of copper in my morning coffee, gone after the first sip. I was tired. I was overworked. My ex, Chloe, had always said I lived too much in my head, that my obsession with signals and systems made me detached from the real world. Maybe she was right. Maybe the real world was starting to fray at the edges because I wasn't paying it enough attention. The turning point came on a Tuesday night. I was at my desk, trying to debug a flaw in a new antenna design. The window was open, letting in the cool night air. The only light in the room was the green glow of my monitors and the warm orange cone of the sodium vapor streetlight on the curb. And then the light began to flicker. It wasn't the random, sickly flutter of a dying bulb. It was a pattern. Rhythmic. Intentional. Short. 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 A pause. Long, long, long. A pause. Short. 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 My blood ran cold. I wasn't an expert, but I knew basic Morse code. SOS. I stared, mesmerized. The pattern repeated, over and over, a silent, luminous scream into the suburban dark. I grabbed my phone and started recording, the lens aimed at the pulsing orange light. After a minute, it stopped, reverting to its steady, unwavering glow. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was different. The smell could be a chemical spill. The sound could be a faulty chip. But this? This was structured information. A distress call from a piece of municipal infrastructure. The next morning, I saw Mrs. Gable retrieving her newspaper from her driveway. I jogged across the street, my phone in my pocket, feeling a surge of nervous energy. "Morning, Mrs. Gable," I said, trying to sound casual. "Did you happen to notice the streetlight out front last night? It was going haywire." She straightened up, a placid smile on her face. Her eyes, pale blue and slightly watery, held no trace of concern. "Oh, was it, dear? I didn't notice a thing. Slept like a log." "It was really strange," I pressed, my voice a little too eager. "It was flickering, like, in a pattern. Like it was trying to signal something." She tilted her head, her smile unwavering. It was the kind of patient, indulgent smile you'd give a child describing a monster under their bed. "Well, I'm sure they'll send someone from the city to fix it. The jasmine is just starting to bloom again, can you smell it? Simply lovely this time of year." She took a deep, theatrical sniff of the air. The air where, just a week before, I had smelled nothing but burning electronics. Today, to me, it smelled of nothing at all. Just bland, empty air. But for her, it was jasmine. I retreated to my house, the recording on my phone feeling less like evidence and more like a symptom of my own private madness. I called my oldest friend, David, a software engineer in Austin. I explained the smell, the washing machine, the streetlight. I tried to make it sound like a funny anecdote, a quirky string of coincidences. His response was exactly what I should have expected. "Dude, you need a vacation. Seriously. You've been locked in that spare room for, what, 18 months? Your brain is compiling garbage code. You're pattern matching everything. The streetlight was probably a faulty ballast. The human brain is designed to find signals in noise, that's all. It was SOS, Dave. It was perfect. Confirmation bias," he said, his voice laced with friendly certainty. "You wanted it to be something, so it was. Book a flight to Austin. We'll drink beer, watch sports, and reset your kernel." I hung up, feeling a profound sense of isolation settle over me. He was probably right. They were probably all right. It was me. I was the faulty component. The system was fine, I was the one introducing the noise. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a fresh moleskine notebook. With a fine-tipped pen, I wrote the date at the top of the first page. Even if it was all in my head, I decided, I was going to document it. I drew a small diagram of the corner of Oakhaven and Cypress, marking the spot of the ozone smell with an X. Below it, I wrote the notes of the washing machine's song, forward and backward. And below that, I transcribed the light. The world felt steady and real. My notebook felt like proof of my own insanity. I couldn't decide which was more terrifying. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The rationalizations held for a week. I forced myself into a new routine. I worked less, walked more, avoiding the corner of Oakhaven and Cypress, and drove to the coast to smell the salt and feel the solid, tangible reality of the waves. I tried to believe David. I was burned out. My senses were playing tricks on me. Then the smell returned, and it was no longer stationary. It was a phantom tide, ebbing and flowing through the neighborhood. I'd catch a whiff of it while getting the mail, a sharp tang of ozone that would vanish as soon as I turned my head. One afternoon, I watched a thin heat haze shimmer above the asphalt down the street, and the air within it crackled with that electric scent. It was like a pocket of a different atmosphere had been temporarily grafted onto our own. The sounds, too, were multiplying. It wasn't just my washing machine anymore. The gentle chime of the self-checkout at the Vaughn's supermarket began to stutter, playing a syncopated, arrhythmic beat that made my teeth ache. The crosswalk signal at the library, a chirping bird sound, would sometimes pitch shift down into a demonic, guttural croak for a single cycle. Each time, I'd look around, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign of annoyance or confusion on the faces of the people around me. Nothing. They scanned their groceries, they waited for the light, placid and undisturbed. Their reality remained intact. It was only mine that was being corrupted. My notebook was getting fuller. I started a map of the ozone sightings, marking each with a date and time. There was no discernible pattern yet, but the occurrences were becoming more frequent. The Morse code from the streetlight outside my window had not repeated its SOS, but it had started a new, more complex series of pulses. They were too fast for me to transcribe by hand, a frantic clatter of dits and dahs that sounded less like a call for help and more like a high-speed data transmission. My isolation deepened with each new entry in the journal. The world was splitting into two versions, the one everyone else lived in, and the one I was experiencing. My attempts to bridge the gap were futile. I tried playing a recording of the stuttering checkout chime for a cashier. She listened, frowned, and said, "Sounds fine to me. Do you want paper or plastic?" Her tone was flat, disinterested. The dismissal was worse than arguing, it was a quiet, solid confirmation that I was alone in my sensory prison. To escape the oppressive silence of my house and the growing strangeness of my neighborhood, I began working from a local coffee shop, the daily grind. It was an anchor to normalcy, with its smell of burnt coffee and steamed milk, the clatter of ceramic, and the low murmur of conversation. It was there I met Sarah. She was a barista, but you could tell it was a temporary state. She had intelligent, watchful eyes and ink stains on her fingers. During lulls, she would sit at the corner table, sketching intricate, impossible-looking buildings in a large, worn sketchbook. She looked like someone who paid attention to details. We started with small talk, about the coffee, about the weather. Then we talked about her art, my work. I was careful, guarded. I didn't want to scare her off with my burgeoning paranoia. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something other than anxiety. A connection. She was grounded, witty, and seemed to exist entirely in the shared, normal world. I clung to that. This budding connection became my subplot, a personal mystery I was more invested in than the one consuming my senses. Was it possible to build a bridge to someone else when my own side of the river was crumbling into the sea? One afternoon, feeling a surge of reckless hope, I decided to test her. The low, droning hum of the shop's large beverage cooler had always bothered me. Most people tuned it out, but as an engineer, I was sensitive to the 60-cycle hum of the power grid. For the past week, however, a secondary, higher-pitched frequency had woven itself into the drone. It was a faint, piercing tone, like a dog whistle for the soul. "Do you hear that?" I asked her as she wiped down the counter. She paused, tilting her head. "Hear what?" "The cooler." "Yeah, but there's something else in it. A high-pitched sound. Can't you hear it?" I held my breath. She listened intently for a few seconds, her brow furrowed in concentration. My heart leaped. She was really trying. Then, she shook her head, a small, apologetic smile on her face. "Sorry, Alex. Just sounds like a refrigerator to me. Maybe my hearing's shot from listening to the espresso machine scream all day." The hope deflated, leaving a familiar cold dread in its place. Her dismissal was kind, not placid like Mrs. Gable's. But it was a dismissal all the same. Another wall. I started to watch her more closely after that, looking for any sign that she was different. But she remained stubbornly, beautifully normal. A constant, while the rest of my world was a variable. Desperate for answers outside my own head, I turned to the internet. I waded through forums on electromagnetic hypersensitivity, finding tales that mirrored my own, but they were tangled with breathless conspiracies about mind-control satellites, 5G towers activating nanobots in vaccines, and reptilian overlords. The posters were frantic, paranoid, and utterly unscientific. Reading their posts felt like looking into a distorted mirror. Was this my future? Was this the inevitable endpoint of the path I was on? I slammed my laptop shut, feeling more alienated than ever. I wasn't one of them. My experience felt different. It wasn't chaotic, it was structured. It wasn't an assault, it was a change. Then, the anomaly jumped from my senses to the observable world. I was watching from my office window as Mrs. Gable pruned her rose bushes. She moved with her usual slow, deliberate grace. Suddenly, she stopped. She dropped her shears. Her head snapped up, cocked at a precise 45-degree angle, her gaze fixed on the power lines running along the street. She stood like that, perfectly motionless, for a full minute. She wasn't catatonic, she looked like she was listening, her expression one of intense concentration. I felt a primal fear, a true, gut-wrenching terror that I hadn't felt before. This wasn't just my perception anymore. This was real. Just as suddenly as it started, it ended. She blinked, shook her head slightly as if to clear it, and looked down at the shears on the grass as if surprised to see them there. She picked them up and resumed her pruning, humming a cheerful, tuneless melody. The transition was so seamless, so natural, it was horrifying. I saw it again a few days later. A mailman, mid-stride, stopped and stared at a green utility box on a lawn for 30 seconds before continuing his route without missing a beat. A group of teenagers, laughing and joking, fell silent in unison, all turning to look at a cell phone tower in the distance before their conversation resumed as if nothing had happened. They were listeners. My notebook became my only sane confidant. It was no longer just a log of strange events, it was a research journal. I filled pages with sketches of sound waves, my half-baked attempts at deciphering the streetlights code, maps of the ozone clouds that now showed a slow, deliberate drift from west to east across the suburb. And in the margins, I wrote frantic questions. What are they listening to? Why can't I hear it? Why can I only perceive the artifacts, the glitches in the system? I felt like a man standing on the shore, watching a fleet of ships sail by just over the horizon. I couldn't see the ships themselves, only the strange, distorted waves they left in their wake. And everyone else on the beach was slowly turning around to watch them, their faces rapt with attention, while insisting the ocean was perfectly calm. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The breakthrough, or what felt like one, came from my own work. I was calibrating a new, highly sensitive software-defined radio for the defense contractor project. The device was designed to scan a huge swath of the radio spectrum, identifying and isolating even the faintest signals from background noise. I had it running in my office, its digital waterfall display a cascade of green and blue static. Normally, the spectrum here in the suburbs was relatively quiet, punctuated by the bright, sharp lines of cell bands, Wi-Fi, and broadcast radio. But that afternoon, I saw it. A faint, persistent signal that shouldn't have been there. It was a wide, low-frequency carrier wave, almost perfectly flat, blanketing a huge portion of the lower bands. It was incredibly powerful but subtle, hiding beneath the noise floor of most commercial equipment. My high-grade gear could only just resolve it from the static. It wasn't registered with the FCC. It had no modulation. No data embedded in it that I could recognize. It was just, there. A constant, powerful, silent broadcast. And suddenly, a theory clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. A terrifying, elegant theory that explained everything. The contagion wasn't a virus. It wasn't a mass delusion. It was a signal. A signal broadcast across the entire area, designed to interact with the human brain on a fundamental level. It was slowly, methodically retuning perception. And the people, Mrs. Gable, the mailman, the teenagers, they weren't malfunctioning. They were being harmonized. They were the intended receivers. The reason I was experiencing the glitches, the ozone smell, the reverse sounds, the Morse code, was because I was, for some reason, resistant. My brain, or perhaps my specific neurological makeup, was fighting the signal. I wasn't seeing the world breaking, I was seeing the artifacts of a massive, invisible broadcast scraping against the edges of my own unaltered perception. The ozone was the smell of the signal ionizing the air in a way only I could detect. The sound distortions were the signal interfering with the electronics in my house. The streetlight wasn't signaling SOS to me, it was a node in their new network, and its flickering was a side effect of its new function, a data stream my brain was misinterpreting as a primitive code I could understand. I wasn't going crazy. I was obsolete. The thought was more terrifying than any conspiracy. This wasn't chaos. It was a new kind of order. The escalation followed swiftly, as if my understanding had somehow accelerated the process. The listeners became more synchronized. One evening at dusk, I witnessed something that cemented my theory. From my window, I saw my entire street fall silent. The man washing his car put down his sponge. The kids playing street hockey lowered their sticks. Mrs. Gable stood up from her porch swing. In near-perfect unison, about a dozen people stepped out onto their lawns or into the street. They all turned their faces towards the east and stood motionless, bathed in the twilight. They looked like iron filings aligning to a powerful, unseen magnet. The air was thick with the scent of ozone. After 3 long, silent minutes, the spell broke. They all shook their heads, a collective, gentle motion, and returned to their activities as if a commercial break had just ended. I felt a desperate, clawing need to tell someone who would understand. My mind went to Sarah. She was my last hope for a shared reality. I grabbed the portable spectrum analyzer from my lab, a ruggedized piece of equipment the size of a large tablet, and drove to the daily grind. The coffee shop was mostly empty. Sarah was wiping down the espresso machine, which was humming its usual tune, now laced with that piercing secondary frequency that felt like a needle in my ear. "Sarah," I said, my voice tight. I put the analyzer on the counter and powered it on. The waterfall display came to life. I tuned it to the anomalous frequency. A clear, solid line appeared against the static. "Look." I pointed to the line. "This is it. It's a broadcast. A signal. It's what everyone is listening to. It's real. I'm not crazy." She looked at the screen. For a heart-stopping moment, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition. Confusion. Was I getting through? She leaned closer, her gaze fixed on the glowing line on the screen. Then she smiled. It wasn't her usual warm, witty smile. It was a serene, placid expression. The same one I'd seen on Mrs. Gable's face. "It's a pretty pattern, Alex," she said, her voice soft and even. Her eyes drifted away from the screen, past me, and fixed on the beverage cooler humming against the far wall. Her head tilted ever so slightly. She was listening. The realization hit me with the force of a physical impact. She wasn't an anchor. She wasn't a potential ally. She was a yardstick. And I had just discovered that the water was over my head. She hadn't just been changed, she was part of it. My desperate attempt to connect with her, my little romantic subplot, had been nothing more than an old-world instinct playing out in the preamble to a new one. I backed away from the counter, grabbed my equipment, and fled the shop. The sanctuary was gone. The last outpost of normalcy had been claimed. That night, my own house turned against me. The smart speaker in my living room began to whisper, not words, but a soft, rhythmic static that synchronized with the streetlight outside. My server rack, my sanctum of logic and order, began to emit a new sound, not the familiar hum of fans, but a high-pitched, resonant tone that vibrated in my skull and made my vision swim. It was the sound from the coffee shop cooler, amplified 100 times. The signal wasn't just outside anymore. It was being rebroadcast, amplified, by the very technology one used to surround myself. My own home was trying to tune me. With frantic energy, I ran through the house, unplugging everything. The smart speaker, the television, the Wi-Fi router, the servers. I threw the main breaker in the garage, plunging my house into a sudden, profound silence. I sat in the dark, my heart pounding. The only light was the rhythmic pulsing of the streetlight, casting shifting patterns on my walls. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was empty. A void. I had built a technological fortress to understand the world, and now I was huddled in its powerless tomb, besieged by a quiet, pervasive enemy I could not fight, only observe. The world was being rewritten, and I was the last page of the old edition. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. There was only one logical step left. My engineering mind, even in its state of siege, demanded it. I had to find the source. For 2 days, I drove, using the portable spectrum analyzer on the passenger seat as my guide. I took readings from street corners, strip malls, and quiet cul-de-sacs. The signal was diffuse, blanketing, but by mapping its strength, a focal point began to emerge. It wasn't a towering radio mast or a government facility. The epicenter was a new, brutally anonymous building on the eastern edge of the suburbs, nestled between a logistics warehouse and a new housing development. It was a data center. A sleek, windowless cube of concrete and steel, surrounded by a chain-link fence. Its only distinguishing features were the massive HVAC units on the roof, humming quietly. It was the kind of infrastructure project everyone celebrated. Progress. Connectivity. Jobs. No one would ever think to question it. It was the perfect Trojan horse. My confrontation wasn't a dramatic assault. I couldn't breach the fence. I couldn't fight a multi-megawatt broadcast with a screwdriver and a grudge. My final battle was purely psychological. That night, I drove my car to a small, undeveloped hill overlooking the facility. From here, I could see the data center, a dark monolith, and beyond it, the sprawling grid of my neighborhood, a web of glowing orange streetlights. I got out of the car. The air was electric. The smell of ozone was no longer a phantom scent, it was a physical presence, thick and sharp in the back of my throat. It was the smell of pure power. And then, I saw it. Down below, the streetlights were no longer just flickering or pulsing SOS. They were engaged in a silent, complex symphony of light. Entire blocks flashed in unison, sending waves of light cascading across the grid in intricate, geometric patterns. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a visual representation of a massive, silent conversation. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I saw them. The people. Figures standing in their backyards, on their driveways, at their windows. All facing east, towards the data center. Their faces, illuminated by the pulsing network of lights, were calm, serene. Harmonized. They weren't zombies. They weren't slaves. They were connected. They were nodes in a network of a scale and type that I couldn't begin to comprehend. The revelation settled into my mind, not with a crash of horror, but with a quiet, profound sense of awe. This wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a weapon. It was an upgrade. An evolutionary leap delivered by broadcast. The signal wasn't destroying humanity, it was transforming it into its next iteration. A collective consciousness, a hive mind communicating on a carrier wave that I, with my obsolete wetware, could only perceive as static, noise, and decay. The Morse code, the glitches, the smells, they weren't warnings. They were the error messages of an incompatible system, me. The horror wasn't that my world was ending. The horror was that the world was continuing, evolving into something new and beautiful, and I was being left behind. I was a bug in the new code, a ghost haunting the edges of a reality that no longer had a place for me. Standing there on that hill, I felt the full weight of my isolation. I could run. Try to find a place the signal couldn't reach, deep in a canyon, or remote desert, a lead-lined room. But could I really escape something so pervasive? And what would be the point? To live out my days as the last of my kind, a lonely relic, while the rest of the world sang a song I could never hear? The alternative was to stay. To give in. I was so tired. Tired of fighting, of doubting, of being alone. Slowly, deliberately, I walked down the hill, towards the edge of the nearest residential street. I stopped under one of the pulsing streetlights. The orange light washed over me, flashing in a rhythm that felt alien and yet deeply ancient. I closed my eyes. I took a deep breath of the ozone-laced air, letting it fill my lungs. For the first time, I didn't try to analyze it or explain it away. I stopped fighting the hum that vibrated at the edge of my hearing. I stopped trying to filter it, to shield myself from it. I just listened. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the silence and the strobing light on my eyelids. Then, a shift. The high-pitched tone in my ears, the one that had been a torment, began to resolve itself. It fractured, splitting into 1,000 delicate harmonics. The static became a whisper. The hum became a chord. It wasn't noise. It was music. A complex, layered symphony that was resonating not in my ears, but directly in the bones of my skull. Underscore 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 underscore. My house is no longer dark. The power is on. The server rack in my office is humming, but the sound is different now. It's part of the music. The streetlight outside no longer pulses in a code I can't read, its light is a steady, warm glow that feels like a reassuring presence. I sit at my desk. My engineering schematics lie untouched. Instead, I am drawing. With a calm, steady hand, I fill the pages of my notebook with intricate, geometric patterns, fractals of light and sound that mirror the structure of the symphony. They are designs for circuits, I think, but not for any machine I could have conceived of before. They are schematics for a new kind of connection. Through my window, I can see Mrs. Gable in her garden. She isn't pruning roses. She is carefully arranging colored pebbles into a complex, spiraling mosaic on the lawn. At the daily grind, Sarah no longer just sketches buildings. The foam she pours on every latte forms a perfect, repeating fractal, a momentary mandala for every customer. We are all very peaceful. We are all very busy. We are all connected. I take a breath. The air is clean and sweet. The smell of ozone no longer burns. It smells like home. The quiet contagion, the missing word. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The rain in Glasgow isn't just water, it's a state of being. A fine, persistent mist that seeps into your coat, your bones, and your mood. It's the percussive drumming on the tenement window pane, the slick, dark gleam on the cobblestones of Ashton Lane. I've always found a strange comfort in it, in the city's dry and stoic predictability. My name is Ewan MacLeod, and I am, or was, a man who thrived on predictability. By trade, I'm an architectural draftsman. I spend my days in a sterile office near the Clyde, translating the chaotic dreams of architects into the precise, unforgiving language of blueprints. Every line has a meaning, every measurement a purpose. My life outside the office is similarly structured. The same walk to the subway station. The same seat on the Clockwork Orange, the same quiet flat in the West End I share with my laid-back, perpetually untidy flatmate, Liam. It's a small life, a controlled life. And I like it that way. The first crack in that controlled reality appeared on a Tuesday. A Tuesday indistinguishable from any other, damp and gray. We were gathered around the kettle in the office kitchenette, the air thick with the smell of instant coffee and microwavable soup. My manager, Brenda, a woman whose voice could curdle milk, was complaining about her commute. "It's the junction at George Square," she grumbled, stirring her coffee with furious energy. "Absolute chaos this morning. Everyone just sits there. The things. The tall poles with the lights. They're working fine, but nobody's paying a blind bit of notice." I took a sip of my tea. "The traffic lights?" I said, the words feeling perfectly normal on my tongue. Brenda stared at me. It wasn't a hostile stare, just a profoundly blank one. Colin, a junior designer, looked up from his phone with a similar expression of mild confusion. "The what?" Colin asked. "Traffic lights," I repeated, a little slower. "Red, amber, green. You know." Brenda waved a dismissive hand, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Och, don't be daft, Ewan. No one calls them that. The street stoppers. The go-or-wait poles. Anyway, it's a nightmare." She turned away, her conversation moving on to a faulty printer. I stood there, mug halfway to my lips, a cold trickle of unease sliding down my spine. No one calls them that. It was absurd. It was a universal term. But the way they'd looked at me, it wasn't like I'd used an obscure technical term. It was like I'd spoken gibberish. I dismissed it. A weird brain fog moment for them. A new bit of slang I'd missed. Stress. I'd been working long hours on the new Finiston development, my eyes blurring over CAD files until midnight. Of course, I was imagining things. That evening, I walked home, deliberately paying attention. The tall poles at every intersection functioned as they always had. Cars stopped for the red circle, crept forward for the amber, and proceeded on the green. The pedestrians, huddled under their rain shields, obeyed the glowing green and red figures. The system worked. But as I watched, I realized no one looked at them. They just seemed to know when to stop and when to go. It was a subtle shift in behavior, a communal intuition that had replaced conscious observation. I felt a prickle of sweat on my neck despite the chill. The next day, the word was gone for me, too. I was trying to describe Brenda's complaint to Liam, who was, as usual, sprawled on the sofa, surrounded by a fortress of cushions. "Brenda was moaning about the junction," I said. Damn it. The poles. With the lights." The term was gone. It wasn't that I couldn't say traffic light. It was that the conceptual link between the object and the word had been severed. The word felt alien, a foreign sound with no attached meaning. I could picture the object perfectly, the black metal pole, the 3 stacked lamps, but the name was a phantom. A ghost on the tip of my tongue. Liam just grunted. Folk are weird. He wasn't even listening. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't stress. This was something else. I went to my room and took out a new Moleskine notebook, the kind with the crisp, cream-colored paper. I uncapped my favorite fountain pen. On the first page, in my neatest architectural lettering, I wrote. Word lost, traffic light. Date noticed missing, approximate, Tuesday, October 12th. Replacement terms, thingamajig, go-or-wait pole, street stopper. I stared at the entry. It looked insane. The confession of a madman. But it felt necessary. A record. An anchor to a reality that seemed to be eroding at the edges. The next one to go was umbrella. It happened on a Saturday. The heavens opened in that sudden, biblical way only Glasgow rain can, and the street became a moving forest of fabric domes. I saw a woman struggling with hers against the wind, and I turned to Liam. "That's a big," I paused. The word was there, and then it wasn't. It was like a book being slammed shut in my mind. A big one of those. I gestured vaguely. "Her rain shield." It's massive. "Going to get ripped inside out," Liam said, without a flicker of hesitation. Rain shield. It was so clunky, so descriptive and yet so wrong. I looked at the people scurrying past. Did they all call it that now? Had they ever called it anything else? I felt a wave of dizziness. I rushed back to the flat, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm. I opened my notebook. Word lost, umbrella. Date noticed missing, Saturday, October 16th. Replacement terms, rain shield, canopy stick. I looked back at the first entry. Traffic light. The words were there, but the memory attached to them was foggy. I remembered Brenda's confusion, but the certainty I'd felt, the absolute rightness of the word, it was fading. It was like trying to recall the specific taste of a meal I'd eaten years ago. I knew I'd had it, but the sensation was gone. A week later, it was newspaper. People still bought them, these folded sheaves of paper from the corner shop, but they called them the daily print or the morning papers. The single, efficient noun had evaporated. I added it to my book. The notebook was becoming my secret shame, my obsession. I kept it hidden in the bottom of my sock drawer, under a pile of old, mismatched pairs. My list was growing. Key. Bicycle. Stairs. The loss of stairs was particularly unnerving. I lived on the third floor of a tenement building. We still had stairs. We walked up and down them every day. But the word was gone. We had the steps, or the climb up. When I tried to force the old word into my mind, I felt a sharp, slicing headache, a mental recoil, as if from a hot surface. One evening, I sat with the notebook open on my desk, the list of lost words staring up at me. There were 9 of them now. A cold dread washed over me as I looked at the first entry, the one that had started it all. The neat lettering was still there, but the meaning was gone. Word lost, illegible scratching. Date noticed missing, approximate, Tuesday, October 12th. I stared, my blood turning to ice. I couldn't read it. More than that, I couldn't remember what I had written. I remembered the act of starting the book, the feeling of panic and purpose. But the catalyst, the first domino to fall, it was gone. Completely. The contagion wasn't just taking the words from the world, it was taking them from my own memory of the loss. My anchor was a phantom, and I was adrift. The quiet contagion wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside me, patiently erasing its own footprints. I was documenting a theft, but the thief was stealing my records as I wrote them. I looked around my small, quiet room, at the precise lines of my drafting table and the orderly rows of books on my shelves, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly, utterly terrified of the silence. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The next few weeks were a slow descent into a private, whispering madness. The world continued to function with a serene, terrifying smoothness. People unlocked their doors without the word key, using what they now called a lock turner. They rode their two-wheelers through Kelvin Grove Park. They climbed the building steps to their flats. Reality didn't just accommodate the gaps, it seemed to heal over them instantly, leaving behind a faint, puckered scar that only I could see. My notebook became my sanity and my torment. The list grew longer, a litany of the disappeared. Clock. Bridge. Book. The day book vanished was a particularly bad one. I was in the office, and Colin asked me to pass him the reader. I looked at the shelf filled with bound volumes of building codes and material specifications. They were still there, solid and real. But the word for them, the simple, beautiful, four-letter word, had been hollowed out, leaving a dull ache in its place. The what? I asked, my voice tight. The reader, he said, pointing. The big blue one. With the fire rags. He sounded so patient, as if I were a child. I handed it to him, my hand trembling. Later, I checked my notebook. The entry for book was there. But it felt like I was reading about the extinction of a creature I'd never seen. The emotional connection was gone. I knew the word had existed, because my own handwriting told me so, but the concept felt thin, academic. My attempts to breach the silence were met with a soft, impenetrable wall of non-comprehension. Liam, I said one evening, trying to keep my voice casual. Do you ever feel like you're forgetting words for things? He looked up from his games console, his face illuminated by the flashing lights of a digital war. What, like going senile? He laughed. Nah, mate. My vocabulary is majestic. He then proceeded to describe the thing on his screen as a shooty-bang-bang adventure. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. I tried with my sister, Kirsty. We met for coffee on Hall Street. She was a primary school teacher, a woman who lived and breathed language. How's work? I asked. Och, it's great, she beamed. The wee ones are learning their letters. We were doing C today. For the, the furry thing with the whiskers that purrs. Cat. I supplied, my mouth dry. Her brow furrowed. That's a funny word for it. Is that an old Glasgow thing? No, the meow pet. They love the meow pets. Cat. Gone. A word so fundamental it felt like a part of my own DNA. And Kirsty, a teacher, hadn't even blinked. She spoke of its absence as if it were a quaint regional dialect she'd never encountered. I felt a chasm open between us, a void filled with all the unwords. She was on one side, placid and smiling, and I was on the other, alone and screaming into the silence. My isolation deepened. The city I loved, with its gruff humor and vibrant chatter, was becoming a foreign country. The Glaswegian dialect, once a source of pride, was being steadily, silently impoverished. I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of conversations, listening to the strange, clumsy circumlocutions people use to navigate their world. That's when I started noticing the symbol. It was a small thing at first. I was on a bus, one of the big double-deckers heading down Union Street. The space where the first bus logo should have been, on the side of the driver's cabin, was now occupied by a small, stenciled sigil. It was a saltire, the X-shaped cross of the Scottish flag, but it was wrong. It was skewed, asymmetric, with one arm of the cross thicker than the other. It was subtle enough that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. And I, in my desperate search for patterns, was looking for anything. A few days later, I saw it again. It was scratched into the brick wall of a pub where a public payphone had once been. The word telephone had vanished from my notebook weeks ago, leaving a faint, smeary residue. And here was this crooked cross, a tombstone for a forgotten concept. I started seeing it everywhere. It was on the spines of the readers, in the library where the publisher's name should be. It was on a blank metal plate at the base of the Finnieston crane, that great industrial giant that loomed over the Clyde. The word crane was gone, of course. Now it was just the big lifter. The symbol was a marker of absence, a sigil of the void. This secondary mystery became a new obsession. It felt like a clue. The forgetting wasn't random, it was being catalogued by something. It was organized. This thought was both terrifying and, in a strange way, comforting. A pattern implied a pattern maker. An enemy. And an enemy was better than simple, mindless entropy. My paranoia grew, feeding on the silence and the symbols. I felt watched. The placid expressions of strangers on the subway seemed to mask a shared secret. Their quiet contentment felt like a judgment on my own frantic anxiety. Was I the only one fighting this? Or was I the only one who was broken, seeing patterns in the static of a decaying mind? My quest for answers led me to the Mitchell Library, a grand, imposing beast of a building. If the words were disappearing from the present, perhaps some trace of them remained in the past. I felt like a linguistic archaeologist, digging for fossils of a lost world. I started with dictionaries, modern ones. I looked up bridge. The space between bridle and brief was seamless. The word had never existed. I tried older editions, from the 50s, the 20s. Nothing. I felt a cold sweat. It wasn't just that people had forgotten the words, the forgetting was retroactive. It was rewriting the past, plucking the words from history itself. I descended into the archives, the special collections, requesting older and older texts. Parish records from the 18th century, merchants' ledgers from the 17th. It was a desperate, foolish hunt. What did I even expect to find? A footnote? Here ye shall find the word potato, before it was taken from us. It was there, in the hushed, dust-moted silence of the archive room, that I met her. An old woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a cascade of white hair pinned up in a messy bun. She was poring over a huge, leather-bound atlas, a magnifying glass in her hand. I was at a nearby table, staring blankly at a page of a 19th-century Glasgow directory, the list of professions a minefield of forgotten terms. Chandler. Cooper. Wainwright. Ghosts. She looked up, her gaze meeting mine across the polished wood of the tables. "You're looking for them too, aren't you?" she said, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. I froze. Looking for what? The ghost words, she said, a sad, knowing smile on her lips. The echoes. You have the look of a man who remembers what a map used to be called. The word had vanished only yesterday. I'd stared at the Google app on my phone, the web of streets still there, but the label for the thing itself had dissolved. For a moment, I could only stare at her, my throat tight with a feeling I couldn't name. It was relief, so potent and overwhelming it felt like pain. My name is Elspeth, she said, her smile gentle. And I remember. Oh, I remember so much. I wasn't alone. The thought was so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. In the quiet, dusty archive, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten words, I had found another survivor. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Elspeth became my confidant, my oracle, my entire world. We met in secret, in quiet corners of the Botanic Gardens or in the hushed grandeur of the Kelvingrove Art Gallery, speaking in low voices about the great unraveling. She was a retired historian, and for the last 3 years, she had been charting the same decline that I had only just begun to notice. I don't think it's a contagion in the way we understand it, she explained one afternoon, as we sat on a bench overlooking the gray, sluggish Kelvin River. It's not a virus of the mind. I think of it as a simplification. A cosmic tidying up. She had a name for it, borrowed from an obscure philosophical text, the great unnaming. Language is clutter, she said, her gaze distant. Think of all the redundant words, the synonyms, the subtle shades of meaning. It's inefficient. What if reality, or whatever intelligence underpins it, is simply pruning itself? Optimizing. Defragmenting the hard drive of consciousness. Her theory was both elegant and horrifying. It reframed the phenomenon from a malicious attack to a natural, terrifyingly logical process. She confirmed my sighting of the skewed saltire. She called it the void mark. It's like a digital watermark, she'd said. A symbol indicating that a concept has been successfully deprecated and archived. She showed me her own research, far more extensive than my frantic scribblings. She had found hints of it in the past. An 18th century minister's diary describing a silent confusion that fell upon his parish, where the names for tools and livestock vanished for a generation. A medieval illuminated manuscript depicting saints with blank expressions, pointing at common objects for which the scribe, in a marginal note, lamented he had no true name. It was cyclical. A tide that ebbed and flowed across centuries, and our generation was caught in a high tide. Armed with Elspeth's framework, the world became clearer, and infinitely more frightening. The stakes escalated dramatically when the unnaming moved beyond nouns. It started with adjectives. Happy. Sad. Angry. They didn't vanish entirely, but they were compressed into a single, clumsy concept, feeling good, or feeling bad. The nuance of human emotion was being flattened, smoothed over. Conversations became eerily placid. People would describe a bereavement or a wedding celebration with the same detached, neutral tone. Then it came for the verbs. It didn't take them all at once, just chipped away at the edges. Verbs of thought and belief were the first to go. To think. To believe. To wonder. People still had thoughts, but they didn't have a word for the process. Their inner lives were becoming uncharted territory. They just were. The most terrifying loss for me was the word to remember. I was having dinner with Liam. His parents had called earlier, on the talking device. "What did your mum have to say?" I asked. Liam was pushing peas around his plate. "She was talking about the summer we went to Erin. The time with the thing you sit in that floats on the water." "The boat?" I supplied, my stomach clenching. He nodded, unconcerned by his own lexical gap. "Right. The float thing," he continued. "It was a good time. I have the head picture of it." Head picture. Not a memory. The word for the active process of recollection was gone. It had been replaced by a term for a static image, a file stored in the brain. They didn't remember, they accessed a data point. The past was no longer a place you could visit and emotionally inhabit, it was a flat, two-dimensional photograph you could look at. I fled to my room, my food untouched. I grabbed my notebook. I had to write it down. Remember. But as my pen touched the paper, a blinding pain shot through my skull. It was a physical rejection. The word was now so alien, so fundamentally incompatible with the new reality, that even the act of writing it was forbidden. I dropped the pen, my hand spasming. My alliance with Elspeth, my only anchor, began to fray. I met her at our usual spot in the library, and I could see the change in her. Her sharp eyes were a little duller, her movements less precise. "Ewan," she said, her voice lacking its usual crispness. I was looking at the old maps. The ones of the city from before the big build-up. The Industrial Revolution. She stared at me, her head tilted. What a complicated sound. No, the time before all the smokehouses. Factory. The word was gone. She, the historian, had lost a word for an entire era. "Elspeth," I whispered, leaning closer. "What do we call the thing that's happening?" "The Great." The Great, I couldn't say it. The name she had given it, the unnaming, was gone from my own mind. A look of profound, heartbreaking sorrow passed over her face. She knew what I was asking. She opened her mouth, and for a moment, I saw the struggle, the desperate rummaging in a mind that was being systematically emptied. The big quiet," she finally said, her voice small. She looked down at her hands. "It's getting harder, Ewan. The words, they were like little lights. And they're going out, one by one. It's so much darker now. That was the last time we had a truly coherent conversation. Our subsequent meetings were fragmented, sad affairs. We were two people trying to describe the color blue to each other after the concept of color had been erased. We would point at things, use clumsy gestures, our shared understanding dwindling with every lost word. Soon, she stopped coming to the library altogether. I was alone again, but this time it was worse. I had known companionship, and now I was a widower of the mind. The city grew quieter. Not in volume, the cars, the subway, the chatter were all still there. But it was a different kind of quiet. A conceptual silence. The world was becoming simpler, less demanding. The people in it seemed calmer, their faces untroubled by the complexities of deep emotion or abstract thought. They were serene. It was the serene, placid contentment of livestock. One evening, I stood at my window, looking down at the street. A couple walked by, holding hands. They weren't speaking. They just looked at each other with a simple, unreadable fondness. There was no word for what they felt. Not anymore. There was only the feeling itself, pure and unlabeled. And for a terrifying, seductive moment, I felt a pang of envy. My head hurt from the constant effort of remembering, of fighting, of cataloging the losses. Theirs was a world without that burden. A world of peaceful, thoughtless existence. The unnaming wasn't a threat anymore. It was a promise. A promise of release. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The confrontation didn't happen in a shadowy alleyway or a secret government facility. It happened in my own flat, on a Tuesday evening, with the relentless Glasgow rain whispering against the glass. There was no villain to unmask, no button to press, no monster to fight. The battle was internal, and I was losing. The forgetting was accelerating. It was no longer just nouns and verbs. It was eating concepts whole. The idea of the future. Gone. People still made plans, but the notion of a timeline stretching out ahead of them, a canvas of possibility, had vanished. There was only the next task. The idea of self. Gone. People had names, bodies, routines, but the internal, narrative sense of being a distinct individual with a history and a destiny had dissolved into a simple, present-tense awareness. I was the last bastion of a forgotten world, and my fortress was crumbling. I spent my hours clutching my notebook, trying to shore up my own identity. I would read the list of lost words aloud, the sounds feeling more alien and pointless each time. Bridge. Clock. Book. Remember. Hope. Love. Ewan. That night, the unnaming came for the very tools of my resistance. I was sitting at my desk, the Anglepoise lamp casting a warm circle of light on the Moleskine. I uncapped my fountain pen, its familiar weight a small comfort. I decided I would write my own story. I would write down everything that had happened, from the first lost word, whatever it was, to this very moment. A final act of defiance. I put pen to paper, my mind full of sentences, of memories, of fear. I wrote, "My name is." The ink flowed from the nib, a deep, dark blue. But the shapes it formed on the page were not letters. I watched, my hand moving but not under my own control, as the ink coalesced into the familiar, terrifying shape of the skewed Psalter. The void mark. I snatched my hand back as if burned. I stared at the page. The symbol pulsed with a silent, absolute authority. I tried again, concentrating with all my might, forcing the letters for my name into my mind's eye. EWN. My hand moved again. Another crooked cross appeared next to the first. A wave of profound, soul-shattering despair washed over me. It was over. The contagion wasn't just in the world, or even in my mind, it had infected the very bridge between mind and world. The act of writing, of making a mark, of recording, was now co-opted. My rebellion was being overwritten in real time. I frantically flipped back through the notebook. Every page was a wasteland of these symbols. Where my neat, architectural script had once listed the dead words, there were now just rows and rows of crooked crosses. My entire history of the plague had been erased and replaced with its own sigil. My anchor hadn't just been a phantom, it had been a Trojan horse, a record of the disease that was, itself, the final symptom. In that moment, the fight drained out of me. The tension I had carried in my shoulders for months, the frantic energy that had kept me hunting for answers, the desperate need to hold on, it all just stopped. It wasn't a surrender. It was a release. A profound and terrifying peace settled over me. The pain in my head, the constant, grinding effort of holding on to obsolete concepts, subsided. The silence I had feared for so long was no longer empty. It was full. It was calm. I dropped the pen. It clattered onto the desk. The sound was just a sound, free of name or meaning. I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at Glasgow. The streetlights, I had no name for them, but their orange glow was warm on the wet tarmac. The buildings, I had no name for their style or structure, but their shapes were solid against the dark sky. The rain, I had no name for it, but I could feel its gentle, persistent presence, a coolness on the air. My mind, once a noisy archive of words, names, and memories, was quiet. The anxiety was gone. The loneliness was gone. The fear was gone. There was only the seeing, the hearing, the feeling. There was no Ewan MacLeod, draftsman, son, brother. There was just this awareness, looking out of this window. Below, two figures walked by, sharing one of the rain shields. They moved in perfect, unspoken synchronicity. Their faces were calm, placid. I understood them now. They were not empty. They were free. Free from the burden of narration, of interpretation, of memory. Free from the exhausting, endless effort of being a self. The unnaming wasn't a loss. It was a shedding. It was the universe returning to a simpler, more elegant state. A state of pure being, without the clumsy clutter of consciousness. I looked back at the notebook on the desk, its pages filled with the neat, repeating symbol. It was not a mark of absence. It was a mark of completion. A sign that the system had been successfully optimized. A faint smile touched my lips. I felt no happiness, no sadness. I just felt correct. The quiet was no longer a contagion. It was the cure. The light was a good color. It was enough. 3 steps to the left. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life in Toronto was a carefully curated exercise in vertical living. I existed on the 27th floor of the Meridian, a tower of glass and steel that speared the sky just south of Bloor Street. My world was a 700 square foot box with a billion-dollar view of a city I barely touched. As a freelance user interface designer, my clients were pixels on a screen and voices on a Slack call. My commute was the 10 steps from my bed to my desk. My social life was the polite nod I exchanged with my neighbors in the hushed, carpeted hallways. I was an island, 27 stories above the street-level sea, and I liked it that way. My neighbor across the hall, in 27B, was a man named Arthur Henderson. He was a retired accountant, neat and precise in a way that seemed to have been ironed into his very soul. His silver hair was always combed, his cardigans were always cashmere, and his shoes, whenever I saw them, shone with a quiet diligence. We exchanged maybe a dozen words a week. Cold one today, eh? Package for you at the concierge, Alex. Have a good one. He was a fixed point in my contained universe, as reliable and unremarkable as the hum of the building's HVAC system. The change began on a Tuesday. It was 3 p.m. I know the exact time because I was procrastinating on a wireframe, watching the digital clock on my monitor click over. I heard the soft snick of a deadbolt turning in the hallway. It was Henderson's door. I wasn't a curtain twitcher by nature, but the sound was unusual. Henderson left for his walk at 10 a.m. and returned by 11:30. His afternoons were silent. Curiosity, that treacherous human impulse, got the better of me. I muted my speakers and crept to my door, pressing my eye to the peephole. The fisheye lens warped the hallway into a long, curved tunnel. Henderson stepped out of his apartment. He was dressed in his usual indoor attire, gray slacks, a navy cardigan. He closed the door behind him until it clicked shut. Then he did something odd. He took 3 distinct, measured steps to his left, placing him directly in front of the generic watercolor print that the building management had hung on the wall. He stopped. His hands were clasped behind his back. He stood there for a long, silent count of 5, his gaze fixed on the painting of a nondescript shoreline. Then, just as deliberately, he turned, walked back to his door, unlocked it, and went inside. The deadbolt slid home. I stared at the empty hallway, my own reflection a distorted ghost in the peephole's glass. What the hell was that? I tried to rationalize it. He forgot something. No, he didn't go back in for anything. Maybe it was a muscle spasm, a cramp in his leg. Or a senior moment, a brief lapse in, whatever it is that lapses in those moments. I shook my head, walked back to my desk, and tried to forget it. It was weird, but it was Henderson's weirdness, not mine. At 4 p.m., it happened again. The snick of the lock. The soft creak of the door. I was at the peephole in a second, my heart thumping with a ridiculous, unwarranted anxiety. The exact same ritual. He emerged. Closed the door. 3 steps to the left. The pause, facing the bland artwork. The return. The lock. It was a perfect, frame-by-frame recreation. I didn't work for the next hour. I sat on my sofa, staring at my own front door, listening. At precisely 5 p.m., the sequence repeated. I didn't even need the peephole anymore, the sounds were enough. Click. Creak. 3 soft footfalls on the carpet. A pause of pregnant silence. 3 footfalls returning. Click. Lock. My mind raced, grasping for anchors. OCD. He'd developed a new compulsion. It was a classic manifestation, the need for ritual to soothe an inner anxiety. I felt a pang of sympathy for him, mingled with the selfish relief of a diagnosis. It was a known quantity, a psychological tic. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a glitch in the world. It was just a sad, lonely old man with a new problem. I decided to ignore it, to afford him his privacy. But you can't consciously ignore something. The decision to ignore it is, in itself, a form of attention. Every hour, on the hour, I'd find myself holding my breath, waiting for the sounds from the hall. Click. Creak. Step, step, step. Pause. Step, step, step. Click. Lock. It became the new metronome of my afternoon, a quiet, maddening clock chiming away the hours. A week later, the strangeness began to leak from under Henderson's door. I was heading out for a rare grocery run. As I waited for the elevator, the doors slid open to reveal Priya Sharma from the 15th floor. She was a lawyer, always immaculate in a sharp business suit, her phone perpetually pressed to her ear. She stepped out, nodding a brief hello. Her call had just ended. She turned to the up button, though we were both going down. She then jabbed the down button, not once, but 7 times. 7 rapid, hard stabs with her index finger. Tap 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 tap. The button's illuminated ring flickered with each impact. Then she relaxed, her hand dropping to her side as if nothing had happened, and offered me a placid smile. Going down? She asked, her voice perfectly normal. Yeah, I managed, stepping inside. The ride was silent. I watched her out of the corner of my eye. She was scrolling through emails, the picture of corporate composure. The 7 jabs were forgotten, an anomaly erased from her memory. I dismissed it. Stress. Everyone's stressed. People have weird habits. I once had a roommate who had to turn the volume knob on the TV to an even number. It was nothing. But the incidents began to accumulate, like dust motes in a sunbeam, invisible on their own, but slowly coalescing into a hazy cloud. There was the man on the 5th floor, a young guy with a fluffy golden retriever, who now, every single time he entered or exited the lobby, would lead his dog in a perfect circle around the large ceramic planter. The dog seemed perpetually confused, pulling at the leash, but the man was insistent, his jaw set in concentration until the loop was complete. There was the concierge, Marco, a cheerful guy who had always been a font of neighborhood gossip. I noticed his new habit while picking up a package. Before handing it to me, he took the scanner gun, tapped it twice on the counter, swiped the barcode, then tapped it twice on the side of the monitor. His movements were fluid but sharp, like a dancer's. I tried to catch his eye, to share a moment of, that's new, but his gaze was distant, his smile a little too fixed. "Marco, you okay?" I asked, my voice tentative. He blinked, his focus returning to me. "Never better, Alex. Just keeping the system running smoothly." He winked, but the gesture felt hollow, rehearsed. I retreated to my apartment. The package feeling heavy in my hands. The building, my safe, sterile tower, was starting to feel off. The air was the same, the lighting unchanged, but the human software was getting buggy. Each loop was small, self-contained, and utterly pointless. 3 steps to the left. 7 jabs of a button. 1 circle around a pot. 2 taps of a scanner. They were quiet, non-violent, and deeply, deeply unsettling. I started a document on my laptop, naming it, the Meridian Logs. It felt foolish, paranoid. But I had to write them down, to objectify them, to prove to myself I wasn't just losing my grip. Date, October 12th. Time, 15 to 1700 hours. Subject, A. Henderson, 27B. Event, hourly ritual. Exit, 3 steps left, pause, re-enter. Consistent. Date, October 19th. Time, 11:42. Subject P. Sharma, 15F. Event, tapped elevator button 7 times before entering. Seemed unaware of action. Date, October 21st. Time, 8:15. Subject, dog walker, 5H. Event, circled lobby planter. Dog resistant. Subject insistent. Date, October 22nd. Time, 16:30. Subject, Marco, concierge. Event, tapping ritual with scanner. Spoke of keeping the system running. Staring at the list, a cold knot formed in my stomach. These weren't isolated quirks. This was a pattern. A quiet contagion spreading through the walls of my building, 1 floor, 1 person, 1 pointless little loop at a time. And I was the only one who seemed to notice. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The next few weeks were a descent into a specific kind of madness, the kind where you are the sole audience to a play everyone else is performing unconsciously. My Meridian logs grew longer. The loops became more common, more varied. A woman in the laundry room who had to resort the darks and lights 3 times before loading the machine. A food delivery courier who, upon arriving on a floor, would touch the wall, then the door, then the wall again before knocking. The world was becoming a vast, intricate piece of clockwork, and I was a loose screw rattling around inside the gears. My isolation, once a comfortable choice, became a suffocating necessity. Leaving my apartment was a gauntlet of tics and rituals. The 7 taps from Priya in the elevator. The planter circling dog walker. The new ones I discovered daily. It was like walking through a field of invisible tripwires. I started ordering all my groceries online, letting packages pile up at the concierge desk just to avoid the scanner ritual. My 700 square foot box became less of a sanctuary and more of a prison cell, the hourly chime of Henderson's door a constant reminder of the encroaching strangeness. The most unnerving part was the placidity. No one seemed distressed by their new compulsions. They performed them with a calm, vacant automaticity, and then resumed their lives as if nothing had happened. The loops were becoming part of the fabric of their existence, new, unwritten social grammar that I couldn't understand. My attempts to breach this placid surface were met with a soft, impenetrable wall of confusion. I cornered the dog walker, a friendly guy named Ben, in the mailroom one afternoon. "Hey Ben," I started, trying to sound casual. "I've noticed, you and Rusty have a little routine in the lobby." He smiled, a genuine, friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Routine? I guess so. He likes to sniff the planter." "No, I mean you walk a full circle around it. Every time." Ben's brow furrowed slightly. He tilted his head. "Do I? Ha. Guess I do. Keeps things orderly, you know. A good start, a good finish. Rusty likes the consistency." He patted his dog, who looked up at him with what I could only interpret as profound canine bewilderment. He didn't see the compulsion in his action, only the post-rationalized justification for it. The conversation was over. He had answered, but he hadn't understood the question. My most desperate attempt was with Henderson himself. I timed it perfectly, opening my door the instant his deadbolt clicked shut behind him after his 2 p.m. ritual. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice louder than I intended in the quiet hall. He turned, his expression mild, unchanging. "Alex. All is well. I wanted to ask you something. About what you just did." "What I just did," he repeated, his tone flat. "I've just come in." "No, before that. You came out, you walked 3 steps to the left, you stood for a moment, and then you went back in. You do it every hour." My words tumbled out, a frantic cascade of accusation and concern. He listened patiently, his head cocked. When I was done, he gave a slow, deliberate blink. "Young man," he said, his voice imbued with a gentle, pitying condescension. "I think you've been staring at that computer screen for too long. It scrambles the brain. You should get out more." And then he smiled, a serene, empty smile, and closed his door, leaving me alone in the hallway with the echo of his dismissal. It wasn't a denial. It was a complete invalidation of my reality. He wasn't lying, he simply existed in a world where his ritual was so normal it was beneath notice, while my observation of it was a sign of mental instability. The isolation was crushing. Was I the one going crazy? Was the stress of my hermetic life causing me to hallucinate patterns where none existed? I clung to my logs, my data. The timestamps were real. The descriptions were accurate. The world was going mad, not me. But the more convinced I became, the more insane I felt. In my quest for answers, I fell down the rabbit hole of the internet. I started with mainstream searches: mass psychogenic illness, shared delusion, folie à plusieurs. But those didn't fit. They required a shared anxiety, a panic. This wasn't panic, it was the opposite. It was a creeping, orderly calm. I drifted to the weirder corners of the web. Conspiracy forums, paranormal subreddits, blogs dedicated to Fortean phenomena. I waded through posts about chemtrails, alien implants, and MK Ultra mind control. Most of it was noise. But then, tucked away in a forum about glitches in the matrix, I found it. A post from 3 years ago, by a user named Signal to Noise. Subject: The Dancers. Location: Chicago, Illinois. Anyone else seeing this? It started small. An old woman in my building who would tap every third railing on the staircase. A bus driver who had to open and close his door twice at every stop. Now it's everywhere. People performing these little, pointless movements. I call them the dancers. They don't know they're doing it. If you ask them, they look at you like you're the crazy one. It's like a rhythm is taking over the city, and only some of us can hear the music. My blood ran cold. The dancers. It was the perfect term. I scrolled down. There were only 2 replies. One called him a schizo. The other just said, I see them too. In Brussels. Both replies were also years old. I clicked on signal to noise profile. Last activity, 3 years ago, the day after he made that post. A dead end. But it was the proof I needed. I wasn't alone. I wasn't the first. This was real, and it was happening elsewhere. My focus shifted. If it wasn't psychological, what was it? Environmental? I thought about the subplot from a bad thriller. Was something in the water? The air? My gaze fell on the Wi-Fi router, its blue light blinking rhythmically. A signal? A frequency broadcast through the building's infrastructure. This new theory sparked a sliver of hope. A tangible enemy was better than an invisible one. I began to watch for anything out of the ordinary in the building's maintenance. And I found it. A team of 2 men in plain gray coveralls. They weren't the usual building staff. They were there for 3 days, working on the junction boxes in the hallways, 1 on each floor. They worked in silence, their movements synchronized and efficient. They never made eye contact. I tried to ask one of them what they were upgrading. He just touched his ear, pointed at a pair of industrial-looking earbuds, and shook his head, a placid smile on his face. I took pictures of their unmarked white van from my window, zooming in on the license plate. I ran the plate through an online search. It came back as registered to a holding company with a P.O. box address in Mississauga. Another dead end. The day after I took the photos, the men and the van were gone. And the loops continued. In fact, they seemed to have intensified slightly after the maintenance. Priya's 7 taps were now sharper. Faster. Ben's circle around the planter was tighter, more precise. It was like the gray men had tuned an instrument, tightening the strings to bring the orchestra into a higher state of harmony. My world had shrunk to the size of my apartment. Outside was the dance. Inside was the hourly beat of Henderson's ritual, a constant, terrifying reminder of the spreading contagion. I spent my days staring at my logs, at the dead-end forum post, at the pictures of the white van. I was a detective in a case where the crime was the quiet erosion of reality itself. And then, one Thursday afternoon, the case broke wide open, not with a clue, but with a knock on my door. It was a woman I'd never seen before. She was young, maybe late 20s, with a cascade of dark, curly hair and wide, intelligent eyes that were filled with an expression I hadn't seen in weeks, raw, undiluted fear. "You're Alex from 27A, right?" she asked, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "I'm Chloe. I just moved into 23G. I see you. I see you watching. You see it too, don't you? The loops. The dance." A tidal wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. I pulled her inside, and for the first time in months, I felt the ice of my isolation begin to crack. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Chloe was a PhD candidate in urban sociology at U of T. Her field was the study of microinteractions in dense urban environments. For her, the building wasn't just a home, it was a living laboratory. And the experiment had gone horribly wrong. "I started noticing it a month ago," she said, pacing my living room like a caged animal. She had a kinetic energy that was the polar opposite of the dancer's placid calm. It was my supervising professor first. He developed this tic. Before starting a lecture, he'd adjust the microphone, then tap the lectern 3 times with his knuckles. Every single time. I thought it was just him. Then I saw it in the barista at the campus coffee shop. The way she'd spin the cup once before putting the lid on. Then here. The woman with the elevator button. The man with the dog. We talked for hours. We compared notes, our separate logs of madness aligning with terrifying precision. My meridian logs and her field notes. My dancers and her automatons. She dismissed the idea of a psychogenic illness for the same reason I had, the lack of a triggering panic. It's not psychological, she insisted, her eyes burning with intensity. It's structural. Architectural, maybe. I've been reading about resonant frequencies. About how certain geometric patterns can affect the human brain on a subliminal level. Look at this building. It's all straight lines, repeated patterns, perfect right angles. It's an aesthetic of rigid order. What if the building itself is teaching us? Her theory was both brilliant and insane. The idea that the very steel and glass surrounding us was imprinting a behavioral virus onto its inhabitants. It was more elegant than my crude evil Wi-Fi signal hypothesis. It made the threat something fundamental, something you couldn't just switch off. For a week, Chloe was my lifeline. We were a 2-person resistance movement. We investigated her architectural theory, pulling up blueprints of the meridian, looking for strange symmetries or impossible geometries. We found nothing obviously anomalous, but the building's relentless, fractal-like repetition of form began to feel sinister. We'd meet in my apartment, the one place we felt safe, whispering our theories while Henderson's hourly ritual played out in the hall like a mocking heartbeat. The escalation came on a Monday. It was just after noon. Henderson's door clicked open. He began his 3 steps. At the exact moment his first footfall landed on the carpet, I heard a sound from the apartment below me, a rhythmic, percussive thump-thump-thump. And from somewhere down the hall, the faint, metallic scrape of something being dragged and replaced. Chloe and I looked at each other, our blood turning to ice. "They're synchronizing," she whispered, her face pale. It was no longer a collection of individual, random loops. It was becoming a symphony. A coordinated, building-wide performance, conducted by an invisible maestro. The dancers were learning to dance together. The quiet contagion was evolving, organizing itself. The thought was paralyzing. What was the purpose of this silent, pointless ballet? Was it building toward something? The fear became a tangible thing, a third presence in the room. The building no longer felt like a passive source of the contagion, it felt like an active, breathing organism, and we were indigestible morsels it was trying to break down. "We have to get out," I said, the words tasting like metal. "Not just the building. The city. That post I found. Chicago, Brussels. It's everywhere. But it's concentrated in these hives. We have to go somewhere remote. Somewhere with no straight lines." Chloe agreed. The plan was simple, desperate. We'd pack light, take my car, and drive north. We'd find a cabin, a small town, somewhere the rhythm couldn't reach. The hope was fragile, but it was all we had. We spent the next day preparing, a frantic, whispered panic fueling our movements. We packed backpacks, stuffed cash into envelopes, and wiped our laptops. The plan was to meet in the lobby at 10 p.m., when it was quietest, and just walk out. No goodbyes, no final glances. A clean break. At 9:55 p.m., I stood by my door, my backpack slung over my shoulder, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could hear Henderson's door. The 10 p.m. ritual. Click. Creak. Step, step, step. It was the sound of the prison gates opening one last time. I slipped out into the hall and headed for the elevators, not daring to look back. I met Chloe by the main entrance. The lobby was deserted except for the night concierge, a man I didn't know, who was diligently wiping a single spot on his marble countertop over and over again. "Ready?" I whispered to Chloe. She nodded, her eyes wide. But she didn't move towards the door. Her gaze was fixed on the floor. The lobby was tiled in a complex geometric pattern of black and white marble. "Chloe," I said, my voice tight. "Let's go." She took a half step forward, then stopped. Her right foot twitched. She looked down at it, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "Chloe, what is it?" I grabbed her arm. It was tense, rigid. "The pattern," she murmured, her voice distant. "It's wrong. The lines don't resolve. They need to." Her foot began to move, not towards the exit, but sideways. She traced the grout line of a black tile, a slow, deliberate scrape of her shoe. She moved to the next tile, tracing its edge. Then the next. Her body, once so full of frantic energy, was now locked in a slow, precise, and utterly pointless dance with the floor. "Chloe, no," I begged, my voice cracking. "Fight it." She looked up at me. And the last trace of fear, of recognition, of her, vanished from her eyes. They were placid. Calm. Empty. The same look I'd seen on Henderson, on Priya, on Ben. The serene vacancy of the dancer, lost in the rhythm. "I just need to fix the pattern," she said, her voice a soft, melodic monotone. "It's important to keep things in order." She turned away from me, fully absorbed in her new, intricate loop. My ally was gone. My lifeline had been severed. The contagion wasn't just in the walls, it was a seed inside all of us, waiting for the right pattern, the right rhythm, to make it bloom. I was alone. Truly, utterly alone, in a world that was quietly, calmly, and meticulously dancing its way into oblivion. I stumbled back, away from her, and fled out the revolving doors into the cold Toronto night, the orderly geometry of the lobby floor burning behind my eyes. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. I didn't get far. I ran for 2 blocks, the sound of my own ragged breaths loud in the night air. Then I stopped, leaning against the cold brick of a closed bookstore, gasping. My car was in the building's underground garage. My escape plan was a ghost. Leaving Chloe behind felt like I had amputated a part of myself. I looked around at the city, my eyes wide with a new, terrifying clarity. It wasn't just the Meridian. It was everywhere. Before, I had seen isolated incidents. Now, I saw the symphony. A group of late-night office cleaners moving in perfect, synchronized strokes across the vast windows of a Bay Street tower. The traffic lights on the intersection ahead, blinking not in their usual simple sequence, but in a complex, polyrhythmic pattern of red, green, and amber. A cyclist waiting at the light, his foot tapping the pavement in a rhythm that matched the blinking of a distant billboard. The whole city was a dancer. It had been all along. I hadn't been witnessing the start of a contagion, I was just one of the last to succumb to the music. Chloe's theory had been both right and wrong. It wasn't just the architecture of our building, it was the architecture of modern life itself. The grid of the streets, the cadence of commerce, the pulse of data, the relentless right angles of our existence, it was all part of the score. I felt a tremor in my right hand. I looked down. My thumb was twitching, rubbing against my index finger in a small, circular motion. 1 2 3. Pause. 1 2 3. Pause. "No," I whispered. I balled my hand into a fist, my nails digging into my palm. The muscles in my forearms screamed in protest. The twitching wasn't just a twitch, it was a compulsion, an imperative. My body was trying to perform a movement I hadn't yet learned. It was like a phantom limb, except the limb was a piece of choreography. I stumbled back toward the Meridian, a moth drawn to the flame that was burning it. There was nowhere to run. The outside world was just a larger version of the same dance. My only choice was the nature of my cage. Back in my apartment, I locked the door, leaning against it as a wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me. The twitching in my hand intensified, a frantic, insistent vibration. I fought it, pacing the length of my apartment, my body a battleground. My mind, the Alex that worried about wireframes and felt lonely, was screaming. But another part of me, a deeper, more primal part, yearned to let go. It whispered that the fight was pointless, that the resistance was the only source of pain. The rhythm wasn't an enemy, it was the new nature of things. To fight it was to fight gravity. My confrontation wasn't with a monster or a villain. It was with the very concept of my own free will. I looked around my carefully ordered apartment. The neat stack of books on my coffee table. The pens aligned perfectly on my desk. The laptop centered on its stand. I realized, with a jolt of horror, that I had always had my own little loops, my own minor rituals for creating order out of chaos. The contagion hadn't introduced something new, it had only amplified what was already there. It had taken our small, human need for pattern and turned it into a universal, absolute law. Exhaustion gnawed at me. How long could I fight my own nervous system? How long could I live with this agonizing internal friction? My gaze fell upon the 3 art books on my coffee table. A large monograph on Rothko, a medium-sized collection of Gerhard Richter's abstracts, and a small, square book on Agnes Martin's grid paintings. They were stacked neatly, largest to smallest. But the alignment was off. By a millimeter. The twitch in my hand pulsed, a thrum of approval. The fight went out of me. It drained away like water from a broken glass, leaving behind a strange, hollow piece. Slowly, deliberately, I walked to the coffee table. The twitching in my hand eased, replaced by a sense of purpose. I reached down. My fingers, no longer fighting themselves, moved with a new and unfamiliar grace. I slid the Richter book a few centimeters to the right. I took the small Agnes Martin book and turned it exactly 90 degrees, so its corner pointed towards the window. Then, I walked to the window itself, the glass cool from the autumn night. I pressed the pads of my 4 fingers against the pane, feeling the faint vibration of the city outside. I held them there for a count of 5. And the twitching stopped. The internal screaming ceased. The friction was gone. There was only a profound, terrifying calm. A sense of correctness. Of things being in their proper place. My loop. It wasn't 3 steps to the left. It wasn't 7 taps of a button. It was this. This small, precise, and utterly necessary sequence. I looked out at the city lights, the blinking, pulsing grid of the urban sprawl. I saw it not as a place of chaos and noise, but as a single, magnificent machine, each light, each car, each person a perfectly functioning component. I could feel its rhythm, not as an external force, but as my own heartbeat. The old Alex, the one who valued his isolation and feared the dance, was gone. He had been a bug in the code, an error in the system. Now, I was debugged. I was harmonized. I stepped back from the window. My world was finally in order. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 11 p.m. I felt a gentle, pleasant anticipation. Soon, it would be time to check the books again. It was important to keep the system running smoothly. The hum in the walls. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. It began as a vibration, a ghost in the bones of my apartment. I live on the 7th floor of Kasai Heights, a concrete block in Sujinami Ward that is aggressively, almost proudly, unremarkable. My life, too, was built on a foundation of the unremarkable. I am Kenji Tanaka, a freelance translator. My days are measured in keystrokes and cups of sencha. I translate German technical manuals into Japanese, a profession that demands precision and punishes ambiguity. Order is my currency. The hum started on a Tuesday. It was a low, bass thrum, a B-flat so deep it felt less like a sound and more like a change in air pressure. I first noticed it through my feet, a faint tremor in the floorboards as I worked at my low desk. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and listened. It was there, a persistent, rhythmic pulse. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Like a giant, sleeping heart somewhere in the building's guts. My first assumption was mundane. The elevators. The water pumps in the basement. The new 5G tower they'd erected on the building opposite. I put on my Sony WH-1000XM5S, the noise cancelling a sacred shield against the city's cacophony. The hiss of the air conditioner vanished, the distant wail of a siren was muted to a whisper. But the hum remained. It wasn't coming through my ears, it was coming through me. It was a skeletal resonance, bypassing the technology meant to keep the world at bay. That was the first unsettling detail. The first crack in the logic of my world. I tried to ignore it. For a week, I worked with the volume on my headphones turned up, drowning the hum in the minimalist electronica that helped me focus. But I felt it when I walked to the kitchen, a subtle vibration in the tatami mats. I felt it in bed at night, a thrumming in my pillow that seemed to sync with my own nervous heartbeat. After 10 days of this constant, subliminal companion, I decided to act. My first stop was Mrs. Sato, my neighbor in 7B. She was a tiny, immaculately dressed woman in her 80s who had lived in Kasai Heights since it was built. She spent her days tending to a small balcony garden of shiso and cherry tomatoes. I caught her in the hallway, carefully watering a potted bonsai. "Sato-san, good morning," I said, bowing slightly. "Ah, Tanaka-san. Good morning." Her smile was a fine net of wrinkles. "A strange question," I began, feeling foolish already. "Have you noticed a sound? Humming? In the building?" She tilted her head, her expression not one of confusion, but of serene contemplation. She was listening. But not for something new, for something she already knew. "Ah, the sound," she said, her voice soft. She turned and patted the concrete wall of the hallway, a gesture of deep affection, as if it were a pet. "The building is breathing. It's a good sound, isn't it? It means it is strong." I stared at her. Not, "What sound," but, the sound. She heard it. And she found it comforting. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The hum wasn't a malfunction, it was, to her, a feature. I stammered a thank you and retreated into my apartment. The solid click of my lock doing nothing to make me feel secure. That night, the first visual anomaly occurred. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth. I glanced at my reflection, then at the tiled wall behind me. For a split second, the neat grid of grout lines seemed to curve inward, as if the wall had taken a breath. The corner where the two walls met was no longer a sharp 90-degree angle but a soft, impossible curve. I blinked hard, water splashing from my toothbrush onto the sink. I stared at the corner. It was perfect. A precise, unyielding right angle. The grout lines were straight as rulers. I strained. Stress. The hum was getting to me, making me see things. I had a deadline for a manual on cryogenic pumps, the pressure was high. It had to be that. I went to my toolbox, pulled out a small set square, and pressed it into the corner. Perfect 90 degrees. I let out a shaky breath, a laugh catching in my throat. I was becoming paranoid. The building wasn't breathing, and the walls weren't curving. I was just tired. I repeated this mantra to my friend, Haruki, a few days later over bowls of steaming ramen in Shinjuku. Haruki was a salaryman, grounded and practical. He was my reality check. A hum. And the walls are bending. He slurped his noodles loudly, then pointed at me with his chopsticks. "Kenji, you've been cooped up too long. You're translating machine speak all day. Your brain is starting to think like one. You need to get out more. Find a girlfriend. I'm serious, Haru, I insisted, keeping my voice low. Your building doesn't hum. My building groans when the wind is high and smells like my neighbor's kimchi on Tuesdays. That's it. You're just noticing the building's personality. He laughed. You're turning into one of those old guys who complains to the management association about everything. I fell silent, stirring the scallions in my broth. He was right, of course. It was the most logical explanation. I was a single man in my late 30s living alone in a concrete box, slowly going mad from the solitude. It was a cliché. But the feeling of the hum, coursing through the floor into the soles of my feet right at that moment, was not a cliché. It was a fact. Over the next month, the hum became my shadow. It was a constant presence, the baseline of my existence. And the glitches in reality grew more frequent, more specific. Always in my peripheral vision, always when I was alone. The top of my doorframe would appear to slope downwards. The leg of my chair would seem to stretch, impossibly, for a moment before snapping back. The neat parallel lines of the tatami mats would seem to converge at an odd angle near the wall. I started documenting them. I kept a small, black notebook, sketching the distortions with a trembling hand, noting the time and the pitch of the hum. The hum was changing, too. It was no longer a simple B-flat. It was acquiring overtones, harmonics. Sometimes a higher, flute-like note would weave through the bass thrum. Other times, a grating, dissonant chord would sound for a few seconds, making my teeth ache. My work began to suffer. I would stare at a schematic for a centrifugal compressor, and the clean lines would start to swim, to bend. The precise German words I was meant to translate, Laufrad, Diedung, Welly, would feel alien in my mind, their meanings becoming slippery, indistinct. The most disturbing event of this period happened with my shoji screen. The paper screen separating my living area from my small bedroom was a grid of simple wood and translucent paper. One afternoon, as the setting sun cast long shadows, I watched one of the shadows detach itself from the wooden lattice. It slid across the paper like a drop of ink, moving against all laws of light and physics, before rejoining its origin. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I saw it happen. I closed my notebook. This wasn't stress. This wasn't eye strain. This was real. I was living inside a machine that was slowly, quietly, detuning itself from reality. And I was the only one who seemed to notice. Or rather, I was the only one who was bothered by it. The placid, beatific smile of Mrs. Sato patting the wall flashed in my mind. Maybe I wasn't the only one who noticed. Maybe I was the only one left. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. My meticulous logbook became my only anchor to sanity. It was filled with frantic sketches of skewed perspectives, notes on the hum's evolving symphony, and dates marked with increasing alarm. April 12th, hum shifted to a C-sharp. Lasted 3 hours. The bookshelf appeared to be leaning at a 5-degree angle. Measured. It was straight. April 15th, a new, clicking rhythm underneath the main drone. Like a metronome. Saw the reflection of the window on the wrong wall in the kettle. April 20th, woke up to a complete silence. No hum. For 12 minutes, everything felt normal. Then it returned, louder than before, and the floor felt like it was tilting north. The rationalizations were worn thin, threadbare patches over a hole that was growing daily. I tried to show Haruki the evidence. I took a photo with my phone the moment I saw my doorframe warp. The curve was undeniable to my eyes. I texted it to him, my heart hammering. See? Look at the top. His reply came back a minute later. Dude. It's a door. Are you okay? For real. I'm worried. I looked at the photo again on my phone screen. The line was perfectly straight. A perfect, horizontal lintel. A cold sweat prickled my neck. The distortion wasn't in the world, it was in my perception of the world. Or, more terrifyingly, the world was presenting a sane face to others, a corrected image, while only showing its true, warping nature to me. My isolation became a physical presence, as real as the hum. I stopped accepting Haruki's invitations. I took my deliveries at the door without making eye contact. The world outside my apartment felt suspect. One afternoon, I forced myself to go for a walk, hoping to clear my head. On the train platform at Asagaya, I watched the Chuo Line train pull in. As it entered the station, it seemed to stretch, the carriages elongating like a distorted video feed for a full 2 seconds before shuttering back to their normal size. I looked around wildly. No one else reacted. A mother was shushing her child, a salaryman was asleep on his feet, a group of high school girls were laughing at something on a phone. Did none of them see it? Then I noticed it. A subtle, shared behavior. Every so often, someone would pause, their head tilting slightly, their eyes unfocusing for a moment. A man reading a newspaper. A woman waiting to cross the street. They had the same placid, listening expression I'd seen on Mrs. Sato. They were tuning in. They were hearing the hum, not as a nuisance, but as a broadcast. The contagion wasn't confined to my building. My apartment wasn't the source. It was just an amplifier. Desperation led me to the dark corners of the internet. My search terms grew more esoteric: auditory pareidolia, architectural, shared visual distortion, urban resonance phenomenon, reality warping. I waded through forums dedicated to alien conspiracies, government mind control experiments, and the ramblings of the clearly unwell. It all felt like a dead end, a digital reflection of my own frantic mind. Then I found it. A deeply buried, text-only forum with a stark, brutalist design. It was called the Echo Chamber. The posts were cryptic, fragmented. People describing sounds that weren't there, shadows that moved on their own, a feeling of wrongness in the geometry of their homes. Most threads died out after a few posts, the users disappearing. With trembling fingers, I wrote a post. I kept it simple, anonymous. Subject: the resonance. It started with a low hum. Now the building is changing. The angles are wrong. The sound has a rhythm. Am I the only one? For 3 days, there was no reply. I checked every hour, the silence feeding my despair. Then, on the 4th day, a single notification. A private message, not a public reply. The user was named Akira_7. The message read: "Don't measure the angles. That's the mistake. You're trying to fit it into the old logic. The angles aren't wrong, they are new. Listen to the resonance. They are tuning the space. The question is, are you in tune?" The words hit me like a physical blow. They are tuning the space. It wasn't a decay, it was a construction. A new kind of order was being imposed, and I was the dissonance in the chord. This sliver of validation was more terrifying than any delusion. I wasn't crazy. I was obsolete. My subplot, my little side mystery, became Akira_7. Who were they? Where were they? Were they a victim, a fellow observer, or something else entirely? I replied immediately, my message a torrent of questions. The response came back hours later, just as cryptic. I was an acoustical engineer. I designed concert halls. I thought in terms of reflection, absorption, decay. I was wrong. Sound doesn't just fill a space. It can define it. Be careful. Listening too closely is how they find you. Before I could ask what they meant, another incident brought the threat home. I was running low on food and had to make a trip to the local supermarket. As I stepped out of my apartment, I saw that the door to 7B was ajar. I glanced inside. The air was thick with the hum, a palpable, vibrating presence. Mrs. Sato was sitting in a simple wooden chair in the middle of her living room. She wasn't gardening or watching television. She was perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her head tilted, that serene, empty smile on her face. Her entire apartment was her listening post. As I watched, mesmerized and horrified, she slowly turned her head and her eyes met mine. Her smile didn't change. It wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was inviting. It was the smile of someone who possessed a secret, wonderful knowledge and was pitying me for not yet understanding. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding a frantic, arrhythmic counterpoint to the steady, deep pulse coming from her room. The contagion wasn't just passive. It was aware. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. My correspondence with Akira_7 became my only link to the old world, a desperate exchange of digital messages in a sea of encroaching resonance. Akira, I began to think of them as a person, not just a username, fed me their theory in cautious, fragmented pieces. It's a resonance cascade, one message read. Think of two tuning forks. Strike one, and the other will begin to vibrate if it shares the same frequency. Now imagine something is striking a fork the size of the city. Something is broadcasting a new fundamental frequency for reality. We're not going mad. Our senses are just reporting a conflict between the old frequency we're calibrated to and the new one that's taking over. This was the terrifying insight I had been circling. The people who were comforted by the hum were the ones who had already been retuned. They were no longer experiencing dissonance. They were living harmoniously in the new, warped reality. To them, the angles were right. The stretching train was normal. The hum was the gentle, guiding music of the universe. I was the one out of tune, a screeching, discordant note in their symphony. What is they? I typed, my fingers slick with sweat. Who is doing this? The reply was slow to come. I don't know. A technology we don't understand. A natural phenomenon we've just discovered. Something, bleeding through from somewhere else. It doesn't matter. The effect is the same. The architecture is the first to go because it's the most rigid. The most based on the old rules of Euclidean geometry. The mind is next. The escalation was no longer subtle. It was an assault. One morning, I woke up and the floor of my apartment was tilted at a distinct angle, like the deck of a sinking ship. I had to brace myself against the wall to get to the kitchen. My coffee cup slid slowly across the table. After an hour of this nauseating slant, with a deep, grinding chord from the walls, the floor snapped back to level. Cracks would appear on the plaster of the ceiling, spiderwebbing out from the light fixture. For a few seconds, they would form a recognizable kanji character, oto, sound, or perhaps, ku, void/sky, before sealing themselves over as if they had never been. The hum was now a complex, layered composition. There was the constant bass drone, but now it was overlaid with intricate, shifting melodies of a higher pitch, punctuated by the rhythmic clicking I'd heard before. I could almost discern patterns, repeated phrases. It was a language. A set of instructions. Akira_7 suggested a desperate, dangerous experiment. If it's a frequency, it can be cancelled. You need to create a counter-resonance. A pocket of the old reality. Broad-spectrum white noise might disrupt the signal. Generate it. Amplify it. I spent a day downloading audio files, hooking up my small desktop speakers and an old Bluetooth speaker I had. I turned them all on, blasting my apartment with a roaring static hiss. For a moment, it seemed to work. The hum faded, pushed back by the wall of chaotic sound. The air felt still. The lines of the room seemed to sharpen, to lock into place. A wave of giddy relief washed over me. I had a weapon. The relief lasted for 7 minutes. Then, the hum returned. It didn't just push through the white noise, it consumed it. The drone deepened, dropping an octave, and a new, aggressive, saw-toothed wave of sound vibrated through the walls, making the speakers rattle and distort. The white noise turned into a garbled, screaming shriek. The walls of my living room seemed to visibly flex inward, the space contracting around me. The pressure in my skull was immense. I scrambled to turn everything off, plunging the room into a ringing silence that was soon filled again by the triumphant, steady pulse of the hum. It had adapted. It had learned. I messaged Akira_7, telling them what had happened. The response was a jumble of corrupted text and ASCII symbols, as if the message itself had been warped. In the middle of the digital hash, I could make out a few clear words. Too loud, they heard me, the angle is 93. It's beautiful. And then, silence. Akira_7 never replied again. My ally was gone, consumed by the very phenomenon they were helping me fight. Or worse, they had been converted, their last message a testament to their submission. It's beautiful. The final vestiges of my perceived safety shattered a week later. I was working, trying to force my mind to focus on a German sentence, when I heard a soft click. The lock on my front door. I hadn't touched it. I held my breath. The door swung slowly inward. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. Sato. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her. Her placid smile was fixed on her face. Behind her, in the hallway, stood two other residents of my floor, both with the same vacant, listening expression. Tanaka-san, Mrs. Sato's voice was gentle, melodic, perfectly in tune with the hum that pulsed from the walls. The building is worried about you. My blood ran cold. She didn't say I was worried. She said the building was. You are making dissonant sounds, she continued, taking a soft step into my apartment. Your thoughts are very loud. Very sharp. They hurt the resonance. You should try to listen better. Let the song in. This was no longer a passive contagion. It was organized. It was aware of my resistance. They weren't here to harm me in a way I understood. They were here to fix me. To tune me. I looked past her, into the hallway, and saw the wall behind her bend and shimmer like a heat haze. They were bringing their reality with them. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. I didn't run. Where would I go? The hallway was guarded by the converted, their serene smiles more menacing than any snarl. I slammed the door shut, ramming the deadbolt home with a solid, metallic thud that felt laughably inadequate. I could hear them outside, not pounding on the door, but humming. A low, choral drone that seeped through the steel and wood, a sound that vibrated in my teeth. This was the confrontation. Not with fists or weapons, but with frequencies. My apartment, my sanctuary, had become my tomb, the walls themselves the instruments of my conversion. The hum reached a violent crescendo. A physical pressure that made the room swim. The floor buckled, rising and falling like a gentle swell on a concrete ocean. The ceiling light fixture drooped, its cord stretching like taffy, the light swirling within it like a captured nebula. The corner where I had once pressed my set square was now a fluid, shifting vortex. My logbook slid off the desk and was consumed by a patch of floor that had turned momentarily to black, viscous liquid. The evidence of my sanity was gone. My carefully constructed reality was being unwritten, erased by a new and terrible grammar. The pain in my head was excruciating, a migraine of shattered physics. Resistance was pain. Dissonance was agony. A desperate, primal instinct took over. I had to get out. Not just out of the apartment, but out of the building, out of the city. I grabbed a backpack, shoving my laptop and wallet inside, my movements clumsy and uncoordinated on the heaving floor. I scrambled to the window, fumbling with the lock. I looked down 7 stories. The street below was a nightmare canvas. The neat grid of Tokyo was a twisting, flowing Escherscape. Buildings leaned into one another at impossible angles. Lampposts bent like wilting flowers. The cars on the road moved in a slow, synchronized ballet, their paths weaving and merging seamlessly. And the people, they were all looking up. Not at my window, but just, up. All of them, hundreds of them, standing on the warped pavement, their heads tilted in that same, placid listening posture. The contagion was complete. I saw a familiar figure. Haruki. He was standing on what used to be a street corner, now a gently curving intersection of asphalt and concrete. He was wearing the suit he always wore to work, but his head was tilted back, a faint, beatific smile on his face. He was listening to the symphony. My friend, my reality check, was now part of the choir. There was nowhere to run. The outside was more alien than the inside. I stumbled back from the window, a sob of pure despair catching in my throat. I was a ghost haunting a world that was no longer mine. I collapsed in the center of my living room, the undulating floor surprisingly gentle. The hum was everything now. It was in the air, in the walls, in my bones, in my blood. It was the sound of creation. I finally understood what Akira_7 meant. The pain wasn't the hum itself. The pain was my resistance to it. Every cell in my body was clinging to an old law, an old frequency, while the entire universe was shifting to a new one. I was trying to hold my breath against a hurricane. I couldn't win. I couldn't escape. The only choice left was to surrender. I closed my eyes. I stopped fighting. I let go of the rigid, 90-degree angles of my mind. I stopped trying to make sense of it, to categorize it, to translate it. I simply listened. I let the hum wash over me, through me. I let it find the dissonant frequencies in my own mind, the sharp-edged thoughts of fear and logic, and I let it smooth them out. The agonizing pressure in my skull began to recede, replaced by a feeling of warmth, of expansion. The concept of a straight line dissolved, no longer a necessity, just a suggestion. The frantic beating of my heart slowed, gradually, until it fell into perfect sync with the deep, rhythmic pulse of the world. Thrum. It wasn't a sound of destruction. It was a sound of becoming. After a timeless interval, I opened my eyes. The room was perfectly still. The floor was level. The corner was a clean, precise 90-degree angle. The light from the window was clear and bright. Everything was as it should be. Everything was normal. Better than normal. It was correct. A profound sense of peace settled over me, a tranquility I hadn't realized I had been missing my entire life. The gnawing anxiety, the constant pressure to maintain order, it was all gone. There was no need to impose order on a world that was already perfectly ordered. I stood up, my movements fluid and effortless. I straightened my clothes. A faint, calm smile touched my lips. The hum was still there, of course. It was clearer than ever. A beautiful, complex, and deeply comforting music. It was the building breathing. It was the city singing. It was the sound of home. The lock on my door clicked open. I turned and walked toward it, not with fear, but with a sense of purpose. Mrs. Sato and the others were waiting in the hallway, their smiles mirroring my own. They were not intruders. They were the welcome party. As I stepped out to join them, my stride fell into perfect, effortless rhythm with the pulse of the new reality. I was no longer a discordant note. I was part of the symphony. The resonance was perfect. I was finally in tune. The quiet contagion, dead air. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The loneliness of 3 a.m. has a sound. It's not silence. Silence is a myth. At 3 a.m. in the broadcast booth of WMPL, the Pulse of the North, the sound is a polyphony of quiet hisses. The whisper of the ventilation system, the low, electric thrum of the console, the almost imperceptible crackle in my headphones that tells me 50,000 watts of power are patiently waiting for a voice. My voice, if I had one anymore. My name is Leo Koval. I'm a night shift radio technician, which is a sterile term for a ghost. I haunt the space between the sound and the silence, ensuring one never fully eclipses the other. My job is to babysit the automated systems and monitor the syndicated feed of Dr. Eris Thorne's show, Northern Nightmares. It's 5 hours of UFO sightings, leyline theories, and hushed interviews with people who claim to have seen Bigfoot in the Boundary Waters. I used to be a musician. I played bass in a handful of Minneapolis bands that almost made it, which is another way of saying they failed spectacularly. Now, instead of making sound, I curate it. I watch the volume unit meters, little green and yellow bars dancing to another man's paranoid fantasies, and make sure nothing goes wrong. It's a quiet life. I'd convinced myself I liked it that way. The first time it happened, winter had clamped its teeth on the city and refused to let go. Snow was piled in petrified gray mounds along the curbs of Hennepin Avenue, and the air was so cold it felt solid. Dr. Thorne was mid-sentence, his baritone voice weaving a theory about a psychic resonance chamber buried beneath the Fauché Tower. The very geometry of the city, he was saying, his voice smooth as bourbon, acts as an antenna, drawing down telluric currents that. The audio cut. It wasn't a disconnect. A disconnect is a sudden, jarring void. This was different. The silence was immediately filled, not with the dead air I'd expect, but with a sound like rushing water heard through a thick wall. A granular, textured static. And within it, whispers. They were faint, layered, impossible to distinguish at first. I ripped my Sennheisers off, my heart hammering against my ribs. The monitors in the booth were silent. I jammed the headphones back on. The static was still there, a tide of noise washing over the frequency where Thorne's voice should be. I strained to listen, leaning into the console, my knuckles white. The lock holds the key. A man's voice, dry as dead leaves. Silas. A woman's, almost a sigh. The whispers tangled and frayed, indistinct again. My training kicked in. Check the board. All green. Check the satellite feed indicator. Solid blue. Check the transmitter output. Perfect. I toggled the source, switching from the satellite feed to the backup hard drive where the show was also recorded. Thorne's voice returned, seamlessly picking up where it had left off. Currents that can influence susceptible minds. The entire event lasted maybe 10 seconds. My hands were shaking. I queued up the digital logger, the official, second-by-second recording of our broadcast output. I found the timestamp. 3:17 a.m. I put my headphones on, cranked the volume, and hit play. I heard Dr. Thorne's voice say, drawing down telluric currents that, followed by 10 seconds of the purest, most profound, digitally perfect silence I had ever heard. No static. No whispers. Just nothing. Then, his voice again, can influence susceptible minds. It was impossible. The logger records what goes out over the air. Exactly. If I heard static, the logger should have recorded static. Auditory hallucination, I muttered, the words sounding loud and foolish in the sterile booth. Microsleep. I'd been working doubles to cover for a sick colleague. My brain, starved for rest, had simply filled in the blanks with nonsense from the show I was monitoring. It was the only logical explanation. I made a note in the paper log, brief signal interruption, SAT feed, 317, duration -10s, resolved by switching to HD backup, and tried to forget it. But the phrase echoed. The lock holds the key. It was meaningless, a line worthy of Dr. Thorne's show itself. A cheap paradox. A few days later, I was walking home through the Skyway system, the enclosed pedestrian bridges that webbed the downtown core. It was a concrete and glass artery, sterile and empty in the early morning. Near the Idea Center, I saw it. Scrawled in black marker on a pane of plexiglass overlooking the street was a crude drawing of a padlock. Inside the padlock, where the shackle should have been, was a drawing of an old-fashioned skeleton key. The lock holds the key. I stopped, my breath fogging the cold air in front of me. It was a coincidence. A stupid piece of graffiti. Minneapolis was full of art students and wannabe philosophers. But my heart was doing that same frantic tap dance it had done in the booth. The name, too. Silas. It snagged in my memory. Walking past a bus shelter on Nicollet Mall, I saw a man bundled in layers of filthy blankets, rocking back and forth, his lips moving. As I passed, a single word cut through his quiet mumbling, clear and sharp in the frozen air. Silas. I flinched like I'd been slapped. I spun around, but he was just a shape in the periphery, a fixture of the urban landscape, already lost to the background noise. I started drinking more coffee. I double-checked my work. I told myself I was succumbing to the very paranoia Dr. Thorne peddled every night. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine. I had been given 2 random data points, a phrase and a name, and now my mind was desperately trying to find them in the wild, to prove it hadn't just invented them. Confirmation bias. That's all it was. The world hadn't changed. I had. I was just tired. I was just stressed. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. It was like having a tune stuck in my head, only the tune was made of static, and the lyrics were a language I wasn't supposed to understand. Every quiet moment felt charged, as if the silence was just a thin membrane, and something was whispering on the other side, waiting for another tear in the signal. My apartment in Whittier was my sanctuary, a small one-bedroom filled with old records and dusty instruments I never touched. I'd sit by the window, watching the snow fall, and try to focus on the mundane, the groan of the radiator, the rumble of a snowplow down the street. Normal sounds. Grounded sounds. One evening, I was trying to read, but the silence in my apartment felt wrong. It felt thin. I turned on a fan for white noise, but the rhythmic whirring seemed to have a cadence, a pattern that felt unnervingly close to speech. I shut it off. The hum of my refrigerator took its place. It had always been a simple, monotonous drone. But now, if I listened, if I really listened, it felt like it was modulating, rising and falling in pitch with a specific, deliberate rhythm. I squeezed my eyes shut. This is not happening. This is not real. I went to work that night determined to be ruthlessly rational. I would do my job. I would monitor the dancing green bars. I would not let the quiet play tricks on me. Dr. Thorne was interviewing a woman who claimed her cat was channeling the spirit of a long-dead pharaoh. Standard Tuesday night. I settled in, my hand on a warm mug of coffee, my eyes on the board. The city outside was a grid of silent, sleeping lights. I felt safe in my glass box, the master of my small, sonic domain. At 2:48 a.m., it happened again. Thorne's voice vanished. The rushing static flooded my headphones, louder this time, more insistent. It sounded like a downpour on a tin roof. And then, the whispers bloomed in the noise, clearer than before, a chorus of disembodied voices. Listen to the color of the hum. 3 steps from the broken tile. The river remembers the salt. This time, I was ready. My phone was already on the console, the recording app open. My thumb stabbed the screen. I recorded 30 seconds of the output from my headphone jack, a direct line of what I was hearing. The whispers continued, weaving over each other, nonsensical and terrifying. Then, as abruptly as it began, it was over. Thorne's voice was back, asking the cat medium if she had noticed any unusual magnetic fields in her home. My heart was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I had proof. It wasn't in my head. I saved the recording on my phone, labeling it anomaly_02. Then, with a sense of mounting dread, I rewound the station logger to 2:48 a.m. and played it back. 10 seconds of perfect, flawless, digital silence. I played it again. And again. Nothing. I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking in the quiet booth. I looked at my phone, then at the logger's pristine waveform on the monitor. Two realities, coexisting on my console. One where the signal was clean, and one where the silence was screaming. And I was the only one living in both. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The next morning, I felt like a man carrying a live grenade. The recording on my phone was a tangible piece of the impossible, and it burned a hole in the fabric of my day. Sleep had been a frantic, shallow affair, and the city seemed different when I finally emerged into the weak afternoon light. The sky was a flat, oppressive white. The sounds of traffic felt muted, distant. My first stop was WMPL. My shift didn't start for another 10 hours, but I couldn't wait. I found Denise, the station manager, in her glass-walled office, frowning at a stack of spreadsheets. Denise was a woman who believed in things that could be quantified: ratings, ad revenue, transmitter wattage. She was pragmatic to a fault, her worldview as neat and organized as her aggressively sensible haircut. "Leo," she said, looking up, her pen poised. "You're early. Everything okay last night?" "Not exactly." I closed her office door. My hand was trembling slightly, so I shoved it in my pocket. "I need you to listen to something. There was another signal dropout last night." Her expression soured. "Your log said you switched to backup. Was there any dead air?" "That's the thing. There was. And there wasn't." The words sounded insane as soon as they left my mouth. Her frown deepened. "Leo, it's one or the other. Just, listen." I pulled out my phone and played the anomaly_02 file. The static hissed from the tiny speaker, and the whispers, faint but audible, coiled into the air between us. Color of the hum, 3 steps. She listened, her head tilted, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Okay," she said when it finished. "That's weird. Interference from a ham radio operator, maybe. Your phone's picking something up near the console. Now listen to this." I swiveled her monitor around, opened the station's logger software, and played the same timestamp. The crisp, clean sound of nothing filled the office. 10 seconds of professional-grade silence. She looked from the monitor to me, her patience visibly fraying. "Right. So the official broadcast log is clean. Which is what matters. Your phone picked up some stray RF noise. Case closed. Leo, are you getting enough sleep?" "Denise, I heard this through the station's own equipment. Through my broadcast headphones. It was on the air. My phone just proves I'm not imagining it." "Your phone proves your phone is a crappy, unshielded receiver," she countered, turning back to her spreadsheets. "The logger is the ground truth. It's what the FCC would look at. It's what I look at. The signal was clean. End of story. Don't waste my time with this ghost-in-the-machine stuff again." I stood there for a moment, the grenade in my pocket suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. She wasn't being malicious. She was being rational. In her world, the world of spreadsheets and verifiable data, I was the anomaly. I left her office without another word, the sound of her pen scratching on paper feeling like a door closing. The isolation began to crystallize. It wasn't just the loneliness of the night shift anymore, it was the loneliness of a man whose senses were reporting a different reality from everyone else. I started a journal, a cheap spiral notebook where I documented everything. The dates and times of the incidents. The phrases I could decipher. The graffiti. The man at the bus shelter. Every scrap of unsettling data. The pages began to fill with my tight, anxious script. The phrases became a low-grade fever in my brain. Listen to the color of the hum. I found myself in the appliance aisle at Target, standing motionless in front of a bank of refrigerators, tilting my head, trying to hear what the whispers meant. The steady drone of the compressors did seem to have a texture, a visual quality in my mind's eye, a sort of shimmering, oily green. I felt a strange sense of vertigo and had to tear myself away, my skin clammy. 3 steps from the broken tile. I became obsessed with the ground. I'd scan sidewalks, the linoleum floors of grocery stores, the terrazzo of building lobbies. I found a cracked tile in the bathroom at work. I stood before it, my heart pounding. I took 3 steps. My foot landed squarely in front of a small, forgotten maintenance hatch in the wall. I pried at it with my fingers, but it was locked tight. The discovery was both thrilling and nauseating. It was a rule. I had followed a rule from the silence, and it had led me somewhere. The contagion, if that's what it was spreading. Or maybe my awareness was just sharpening. The behavioral loops were the most unnerving. I saw a woman on the light rail meticulously tapping her chin, then her knee, then the window, over and over, her eyes glazed over with a placid emptiness. I saw a man at a coffee shop arranging and rearranging the sugar packets into complex geometric shapes for a solid 20 minutes, never once taking a sip of his cooling latte. When I tried to catch their eye, they'd look straight through me. There was no distress in their actions, only a profound, unsettling sense of purpose. My investigation led me online. I fell into a rabbit hole researching Dr. Eris Thorne. He was mostly seen as a harmless crackpot, a purveyor of comforting weirdness for insomniacs. There was no hint of anything malicious. But I found a link, buried deep in a search result, to a message board from the late 90s, Northern Nightmares Anomaly Trackers. It was a digital graveyard, most of the threads a decade old. But one sub-forum, Signal Intrusions, had a recent post. 6 months ago. Heard it again. The static. Behind the caller from Duluth. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Under the anonymous handle Audio Ghost, I wrote a post. Subject, it's happening again. I monitor the WMPL feed nightly. I've been logging signal dropouts replaced by static and vocal phenomena. The official station logger records only silence. Has anyone else experienced this recently? The phrases are becoming clearer. I listed them, the lock holds the key. Silas. Listen to the color of the hum. 3 steps from the broken tile. The river remembers the salt. I hit post and felt a jolt of adrenaline, a mix of terror and hope. I was casting a message in a bottle into a digital ocean. For 2 days, there was no reply. The isolation deepened. At work, I felt a gnawing paranoia. Was Denise watching me? Did she think I was unstable? I started noticing things about my coworkers. The daytime DJ, a cheerful woman named Brenda, would hum a single, monotonous note while waiting for the coffee to brew. The sales guy, Mark, would constantly tap his pen on his desk in a rhythm of 3 quick beats, pause, 3 quick beats. They were small things. Ticks. Habits. But they felt like echoes of the deeper wrongness, the quiet contagion spreading through the station's very walls. Then, a notification. A private message on the forum. It was from a user named Cassandra_72. I've heard them too. For years. The phrases change, but the static is always the same. It's not RF interference. It's too specific. You're in Minneapolis. I'm in St. Paul. We need to talk. Not on here. She left a Proton mail address. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. Or, if I was, there was at least one other person in my specific corner of madness. Around this time, the subplot, or what I thought was a subplot, began. The phrase "the river remembers the salt" had always bothered me. The Mississippi, which bisects Minneapolis, is a freshwater river. It was a geographical error, a piece of nonsense. But out of a desperate need to find patterns, I started researching the history of salt in Minnesota. It was a dead end. No natural salt deposits, no historical salt trade of any significance. It was a red herring. Then one afternoon, walking across the Stone Arch Bridge, a former railway bridge now a pedestrian walkway, I leaned on the railing, looking down at the churning, icy water below St. Anthony Falls. The hum of the city was a constant drone. I closed my eyes, and the other phrase surfaced, listen to the color of the hum. I focused on the sound of the falls, the traffic, the wind. The hum of Minneapolis. And in my mind's eye, it wasn't green this time. It was a deep, murky blue, and shimmering within it, like flecks of glitter, were tiny, sharp points of white. Like salt in water. A shiver traced its way down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The phrase wasn't a fact. It was an instruction. It was telling me to perceive something that wasn't there. To overlay a new reality onto the existing one. I wrote to Cassandra that night. My hands were steady. My fear was being replaced by something else, something colder and sharper, a need to understand. We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop in the Midway neighborhood, halfway between the two cities that were, I was beginning to suspect, ground zero for a quiet and terrible transformation. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The woman who called herself Cassandra was not what I expected. I suppose I'd pictured a fellow night dweller, pale and twitchy, wrapped in the same cloak of paranoia as me. Instead, the woman who sat down opposite me was sharp, alert, and grounded. She looked to be in her late 40s, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the no-nonsense air of someone who organizes things for a living. "You're Leo," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Sarah. I'm a research librarian at the university." Her real name and profession were a profound comfort. This wasn't some internet phantom, this was a person with a library card. We spoke in low tones, the aroma of roasted coffee beans and the clink of ceramic a fragile shield of normalcy around our conversation. "I've been tracking this for almost 5 years, she began, pulling a worn notebook from her bag that made my own look flimsy and amateurish. "It's not just Thorne's show. It happens during other late-night programming, too, especially talk radio. But Thorne's broadcast seems to be the most potent." She had pages of phrases, neatly categorized. Some were instructions for sensory confusion, like mine. Others were simple, declarative statements that were subtly wrong. "The sky is made of brass. Sound travels faster in a vacuum. 2 lines make a circle." And there were more names. Not just Silas, but Alara, and the conductor. "My theory," she said, leaning forward, her voice dropping even lower, "is that it's a form of number station. A broadcast intended for a specific recipient, hijacking a civilian frequency. But it's sloppy. It bleeds. And some people like us, are susceptible to the bleed-through. But the logger at the station," I argued, "it shows nothing. Pure silence." "Exactly," she said, her eyes alight with intellectual fire. "That's the most elegant part. Whatever this signal is, it doesn't exist in the same part of the electromagnetic spectrum as the primary broadcast. It's layered on top, or woven inside it. Our analog brains can perceive it, but the digital recording equipment, designed to capture only a specific band of information, filters it out as a null value. It's a ghost signal that only registers on wetware." Her theory was terrifyingly plausible. It wasn't supernatural. It was technological, a weaponized form of neuromodulation. The phrases weren't madness, they were code. Instructions to deconstruct reality one assumption at a time. 2 lines make a circle, an invitation to abandon Euclidean geometry. The river remembers the salt, a command to impose a false memory on the physical world. It was a virus for the consciousness, and we were the unlucky few who had the antivirus software to see it for what it was, even if we couldn't stop it. The contagion at the station escalated. It was no longer just tics and habits. The placid emptiness I'd seen in strangers on the street began to infect the WMPL building. Denise was the worst. She had stopped managing and started curating. She would spend hours aligning the pens on her desk into perfectly parallel rows. If one was moved, she would stop whatever she was doing, her face a mask of serene focus, and meticulously nudge it back into place. One afternoon I tried to talk to her again, showing her a new piece of graffiti I'd found near the station, a spiral with the words "The conductor leads the hum" painted beneath it. She looked at the photo on my phone, and a slow, beatific smile spread across her face. It was the most horrifying expression I had ever seen. "The signal is clean, Leo," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "Everything is in its right place. Can't you hear how peaceful it is?" I backed away from her. The denial was no longer defensive, it was evangelical. She wasn't ignoring the change, she had embraced it. She was tuned in. The people I worked with were becoming living receivers, their individual personalities slowly being overwritten by the broadcast's quiet, relentless protocol. My alliance with Sarah became my only anchor. We communicated daily, sharing observations. The subplot of Silas, the name from the very first broadcast, became our focus. If this was a signal, who was sending it? Silas felt like a key. Sarah, with her librarian's mastery of archives, dug in. She found him. Silas Crane, she told me over a crackling phone line, her voice tight with excitement. A reclusive industrialist and acoustic engineer from the 1920s. He owned a number of properties in downtown Minneapolis. He was obsessed with resonance, with the idea of sympathetic frequencies. He believed you could make an entire building, an entire city block, vibrate at a chosen frequency, like a giant tuning fork. Where were his properties? I asked, a cold dread washing over me. "You're not going to like it," she said. His main workshop, the place where he conducted his most ambitious experiments in urban resonance, was in a sub-basement of a building that was demolished in the 1950s to make way for a new, modern structure. The structure that now houses WMPL. The pieces clicked into place with an audible snap. Dr. Thorne's show wasn't the source. It was the amplifier. His voice, the station's specific frequency, the location itself, it was all a perfect storm of variables that had reactivated Silas Crane's century-old machine. A machine designed to make a city hum the same tune. "I have to get down there," I said. "Into the sub-basement." "Leo, no," Sarah's voice was sharp. "This is getting too dangerous. We're observers. We document. We don't go poking the source of the anomalous signal with a stick. What if the concentration of whatever this is down there is higher? What if it's getting stronger anyway?" I countered, my voice rising. "What if this is our only chance to understand it before everyone, including us, is just humming along to the broadcast? I have to go." I found a locked maintenance hatch near a broken tile in the bathroom. "It has to lead somewhere." The line was silent for a moment. "This is a mistake, Leo," she said, her voice laced with genuine fear. "Don't become part of the anomaly." The call ended, and the fragile alliance felt strained to the breaking point. She was right, it was a terrible idea. But as I sat in my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator seeming to call my name, I knew I didn't have a choice. I couldn't just sit and document the world as it was quietly erased. I had to see the machine that was doing the erasing. I had to know what was in the dark beneath the station. On my next night off, I gathered a small bag, a heavy flashlight, a crowbar, my phone. I drove through the sleeping city, its streetlights casting a jaundiced glow on the snow. The WMPL building loomed ahead, a dark monolith humming with a secret I was about to confront. I let myself in with my keycard, the click of the lock echoing in the silent lobby. The air inside felt thick, heavy with a silent, expectant energy. I was no longer a ghost haunting the station, I was an intruder. And I was heading for the source. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The sub-basement of WMPL was a place forgotten by time. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete, ozone, and decay. My flashlight beam cut through a darkness that felt solid, illuminating forgotten strata of station history, stacks of vinyl records in moldy sleeves, obsolete tape machines gathering dust like sleeping metal beasts, tangles of thick black cable that snaked across the floor and disappeared into the walls. I found the bathroom, its fixtures stained and ancient. The cracked tile was there, a small flaw in the grimy floor. I stood before it, the whisper from the static echoing in my memory. 3 steps from the broken tile. I took 3 deliberate paces, my boots crunching on the gritty floor. My flashlight beam landed on the small, recessed maintenance hatch in the concrete wall. It was exactly as I'd found it before. The crowbar made short work of the rusted lock. The metal door groaned open on protesting hinges, revealing a crawlspace, a dark maw leading deeper beneath the building's foundation. I crawled inside, the rough concrete scraping my hands and knees. The tunnel, it was more of a tunnel than a crawlspace, sloped downwards, leading to a small, brick-lined chamber. It felt like a tomb. In the center of the chamber was a heavy, oak table. On the table sat a complex and bizarre apparatus of brass coils, vacuum tubes, and copper wiring, all connected to a central, crystalline structure that pulsed with a faint, internal light. It was the source of the hum. The hum wasn't just in my head anymore, it was a physical vibration in the air, in the floor, in the bones of my skull. It was a low, resonant drone that I felt more than heard. Next to the machine was a metal box, secured with a heavy iron padlock. I stared at it, my mind racing. I had no key. The crowbar would make too much noise. Then the first phrase, the one that had started it all, surfaced with stunning clarity. The lock holds the key. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a physical instruction. I gripped the thick, heavy body of the padlock. The key wasn't in the lock. The lock was the key. It was a tool. I raised it, and with all my strength, I slammed the bottom of the padlock against the shackle where it entered the housing. The old, corroded metal screamed and then snapped. The lock fell open. Inside the box was a leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with a spidery, obsessive script. I opened it. The Journal of Silas Crane. I read, my flashlight shaking. It wasn't the diary of a madman. It was worse. It was the diary of a utopian visionary. Silas hadn't been trying to create a weapon. He believed that human consciousness was flawed, a chaotic mess of individual anxieties, desires, and misperceptions. He called it psychic static. His machine, this acoustic resonator, was designed to be the cure. He called it the symphony of consciousness. Powered by the telluric currents of the earth that Dr. Thorne babbled about, amplified by the city's own infrastructure, it was meant to broadcast a carrier wave. A signal that would gently, quietly, tune the human mind. The phrases weren't a virus, they were tuning forks. They were meant to dismantle the flawed logic of the individual ego and replace it with a serene, unified, collective consciousness. The dead air wasn't an absence of signal, it was the signal itself, a pure, conceptual broadcast. For some reason, my history as a musician, my sensitivity to sound, some random quirk of my brain's wiring, I could partially decode it. I was hearing the source code. The others weren't going mad. They were being harmonized. They were achieving the peace that Silas had envisioned. It's beautiful, isn't it? I spun around, my heart seizing in my chest. Dr. Eris Thorne stood in the entrance to the chamber, silhouetted against the light from the tunnel. He wasn't menacing. He wasn't angry. He was smiling that same, placid, beatific smile I'd seen on Denise's face. I was drawn to this place, Thorne said, his voice calm and melodic, stripped of its on-air theatricality. I found this room years ago. I never understood what it was. I just knew it felt right. My broadcast, my voice, it seems to be the perfect catalyst. The final component Silas was missing. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't a collaborator. He was patient zero, the perfect amplifier, the conductor named in the graffiti. His mind was so steeped in theories of strange energies and hidden signals that he had been the first to fully, unconsciously, embrace the symphony. He wanted to end suffering, Leo, Thorne said, taking a step closer. The static of self. The anxiety. The loneliness. He wanted to replace it with harmony. With quiet. You've been fighting it so hard. You hear the instructions, but you refuse to listen. Why? Don't you want the peace? All you have to do is stop fighting. Just, listen to the music. This was the confrontation. Not a battle with a monster, but a philosophical choice presented by a man who had already surrendered. I looked at Thorne's empty, happy eyes. I thought of Denise, meticulously arranging her pens in a state of blissful oblivion. This wasn't peace. It was erasure. It was the death of every thought, every memory, every messy, beautiful, contradictory impulse that made a person who they were. It was the quietest apocalypse imaginable. I looked at the journal in my hands, then at the humming machine. I could smash it. I could try to destroy Silas Crane's symphony. But Thorne was right there. And what about the rest of the city? How many were already tuned? Would destroying it even matter? Or would it be like trying to smash a song after it had already been sung? I made my choice. I threw the journal at Thorne's feet. He didn't even flinch. As he bent to pick it up, I ran. I scrambled back through the tunnel, bursting out of the maintenance hatch and into the sub-basement. I didn't look back. I fled the station, the hum of the machine chasing me, a phantom vibration that I could feel in the soles of my feet. I ran out into the frigid Minneapolis night, gasping for air that felt suddenly thin and full of whispers. That was 6 months ago. I don't live in Minneapolis anymore. I'm in a small, forgettable town in northern Wisconsin, working a job that keeps my hands busy and my mind blessedly numb. I stock shelves at a grocery store. I live in a small room above a garage. But there is no escape. The contagion wasn't local. The symphony wasn't confined to one city. Silas had used the earth itself as his broadcast medium. Minneapolis was just where the signal was strongest. I can't listen to the radio. I can't tolerate a quiet room. The hum is everywhere, a baseline frequency to the world that most people can't perceive. I see the signs, faint but unmistakable. A woman in the checkout line, tapping her fingers on the counter in a familiar 3-beat rhythm. A man staring at a fluorescent light in the dairy aisle, a faint, placid smile on his face as he listens to the color of the hum. They are small signs. Glitches in the matrix. But they are becoming more frequent. The world is being tuned. I got out of the epicenter, but the broadcast is global. The quiet contagion is spreading, and I am a ghost haunting the edges of a reality that is serenely, peacefully, unmaking itself. I am not saved. I am not a survivor. I am just a man who is uniquely cursed to hear the music stop. I am the only one left who can still hear the terrible, screaming silence that lies on the other side of the piece. And every day, the silence gets louder. The wrong light. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. It began with the light. Not a sound, not a tremor, just a change in the quality of the evening. I'm an architect. I live and die by the quality of light. I notice the way a sliver of morning sun can bisect a room, the harsh, flattening glare of midday, the warm, forgiving gold of the hour before dusk. So when the streetlights of Jacaranda Close flickered on one Tuesday night, I knew something was wrong. Our cul-de-sac in the Melbourne suburbs was aggressively normal. A perfect circle of 8 brick veneer homes, each with a neatly manicured lawn and a dutifully placed wheelie bin awaiting Wednesday's collection. The council had installed new LED streetlights a year ago, a crisp, sterile white that bleached the color from the bottlebrush trees and made the world look like a hospital corridor. But this light wasn't white. It was violet. A pale, ethereal, bruise-colored violet. It didn't just illuminate, it seemed to soak into the asphalt, to cling to the leaves of the gum trees, to stain the very air. I was at the kitchen sink, rinsing a plate. My partner, Chloe, was on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, the blue light of the screen a stark contrast to the strange purple hue filtering through the window. Did the council change the bulbs again? I asked, drying my hands. Chloe glanced up, then back down. Looks normal to me. I walked to the window and stared. The Holden Commodore across the street, owned by the Patels, was a deep, lustrous blue. Under this light, it looked like a plum. The manicured hedges lining Mrs. Gable's driveway seemed to drink the violet, their green shifting to a murky, seaweed black. Normal. Chloe, it's purple. She gave a long-suffering sigh, the kind reserved for my more pedantic observations. She was a graphic designer, she spent her days fine-tuning Pantones and hex codes. If anyone should have noticed, it was her. She came to the window, stood beside me, and looked out. It's white, Leo. A bit cool, maybe. You've been staring at blueprints all day. Your eyes are probably strained. She squeezed my arm, a gesture of both affection and dismissal, and returned to the couch. I stood there for a long time, trying to see what she saw. I tried to will the light to be white. But the violet persisted, a silent, insistent hum in a color spectrum only I could perceive. I rationalized. Stress. A mild migraine aura. The start of a cold. There were a dozen logical explanations, and I clung to them as I went to bed. The next morning, the world was normal. The Melbourne sun was its usual, brilliant self. The Patel's Commodore was defiantly blue. Mrs. Gable's hedges were a healthy, vibrant green. I felt a wave of relief so profound it made me dizzy. It had just been my eyes. The incident was almost forgotten until that evening. Bin night. I wheeled our recycling and general waste bins to the curb, the plastic wheels rumbling on the concrete. As dusk settled, a familiar preemptive flicker ran down the street. Then they came on. Violet. A deep, unequivocal violet. I looked around, expecting to see my neighbors squinting, shaking their heads. But no one did. Mr. Patel gave me a cheerful wave as he arranged his own bins. Young Sarah from number 4 jogged past, headphones in, oblivious. And then I noticed the shadows. My own shadow, cast by the porch light behind me, was behaving as it should, a long, gray cutout of a man dragging 2 bins. But the shadows cast by the violet streetlights were wrong. The shadow of the Patel's letterbox, a simple brick rectangle, should have been a stretched, elongated version of itself. Instead, it was curved, like a scythe lying on the pavement. The shadow of Mrs. Gable's prize-winning rose bush wasn't a tangled latticework, it was a solid, unervingly smooth oval. I stood frozen, staring. The geometry was impossible. Light travels in straight lines. That is a fundamental, bedrock truth of the universe I inhabit. Yet here, in Jacaranda Close, it apparently took detours. I felt a prickle of something colder and sharper than the evening air. I tried to take a photo with my phone. On the screen, the light was just light. A bright, slightly blown out white. The impossible shadows were just ordinary shadows. I looked from the phone to the street and back again. The phone showed me the world everyone else saw. My eyes showed me the truth. Over the next week, I became a covert observer of my own street. The violet lights were a nightly fixture. The warped shadows a nightly torment. I started sketching them in a notepad, trying to make sense of their twisted logic. A shadow from a power pole that split in two. The shadow of a parked car that seemed to ripple, as if cast on water. It was a quiet, creeping madness, and I was its sole audience. My isolation felt complete until I noticed Mrs. Gable. She was a sweet, elderly woman, a widow whose life revolved around her garden. One evening, I saw her through my living room window. She was struggling with a heavy terracotta pot, dragging it across her lawn. She moved it a few feet, then tilted her head, considering its position. She moved it again, a few inches to the left. Finally, she straightened up, satisfied. I realized with a jolt that she had moved the pot until its shadow, a long, distorted smear in the violet light, perfectly aligned with the edge of her birdbath's shadow. She wasn't arranging the pot, she was arranging its shadow. I dismissed it. Eccentricity. A new feng shui kick. But the next night, Mr. Patel was out with a spirit level, adjusting the angle of his outdoor table. And the young couple at number 4, the ones who were always hosting barbecues, spent an hour moving a single garden gnome a few centimeters back and forth. Each of them was placid, focused, as if engaged in the most normal task in the world. They were aligning their lives to the wrong shadows. That night, sleep offered no escape. I dreamt of a city of impossible angles, of buildings whose shadows fell upwards, towards a violet sun. I woke up sweating, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Chloe was sleeping soundly beside me. I crept out of bed and went to the bathroom, avoiding the windows. I flicked on the light. Normal, fluorescent white. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes, a few more gray hairs at the temples. Everything was fine. Then I saw it. I was standing perfectly still. My breathing was even, my body relaxed. But in the mirror, my shadow, cast on the tiled wall behind me, twitched. A tiny, independent movement. The head of my shadow tilted slightly to the left, as if curious. I didn't move. It did it again. I slammed the light off and stumbled back to the bedroom, my body shaking. I lay in the dark, my eyes wide open, listening to the hum of the fridge, the distant rumble of a train, the sound of my own sanity beginning to fray at the edges. The world outside my house was being quietly retuned to a new, incomprehensible physics. And the contagion, the wrongness, was no longer just outside. A piece of it was attached to me. It was wearing my shape. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The next 2 weeks were a special kind of hell. I lived a double life. By day, I was Leo the architect, discussing load-bearing walls and minimalist aesthetics, forcing smiles in meetings, drinking coffee that tasted like ash. But as the sun began its descent, a knot of dread would tighten in my stomach. The evening was no longer a time for rest, it was a time for observation. A time for fear. My journal became my only confidant. It was a high-quality Moleskine Chloe had given me for my birthday, meant for architectural sketches. Now, its gridded pages were filled with frantic drawings of impossible shadows, annotated with dates, times, and the increasingly bizarre behavior of my neighbors. October 12th, the Patels have moved their entire outdoor furniture set. The chairs are no longer facing the table. They're in a line, facing the house, each perfectly spaced so their bent shadows form a continuous, wave-like pattern on the lawn. October 15th, saw Sarah from number 4 come out at 10 p.m. She didn't go for a run. She just stood on her driveway, her head cocked, as if listening to the light. Stayed there for 20 minutes, then went back inside. October 19th, Mrs. Gable is painting her fence. But she's not painting the fence itself. She's painting the shadows of the palings onto the fence. The lines are ruler straight, but they don't match the actual palings. They match the curved, distorted shadows they cast in the violet light. My attempts to breach the subject with Chloe grew more desperate, and in turn, more alienating. It's not just the light anymore, I told her one evening, my voice tight. Look at the Patel's yard. Does that look normal to you? She glanced out the window, her expression carefully neutral. They're redecorating, Leo. People do that. They're not redecorating. They're aligning. To the shadows. The wrong shadows. The word wrong hung in the air between us, heavy and accusatory. There's nothing wrong with the shadows, she said, her voice gentle, the way you'd speak to a frightened child or a delirious patient. Maybe you should book an appointment with Dr. Chen. Just to talk. You've been under a lot of pressure with that new project. The suggestion felt like a slap. She didn't believe me. Worse, she thought I was losing my mind. The chasm between us widened with every violet evening. I was on one side, in a world of impossible geometry and creeping dread, and she was on the other, in the safe, sane world of white light and predictable physics. I stopped talking about it. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. My shadow became my personal tormentor. Its independent movements grew bolder. While I sat at my desk, my shadow hand would reach out and trace the rim of my coffee mug. When I drove, my shadow self in the driver's side window would turn to look at things I wasn't looking at. I started wearing long-sleeved shirts, even on warm days. I took to walking on the other side of the street to avoid my own reflection in shop windows. I was becoming a stranger to my own silhouette. Convinced that there had to be a rational, physical explanation, I dove into research. My first stop was the local council's website, searching for public works orders, lighting tenders, anything related to jacaranda clothes. Nothing. I found the manufacturer of the LED streetlights. Their specifications were clear: 4000 K color temperature, a cool, clinical white. No mention of a violet option. This failure pushed me towards a new, more unsettling path. If it wasn't the lights themselves, maybe it was the land. I took a trip to the municipal library, a quiet, dusty building that smelled of decaying paper and floor polish. I started pulling old maps of the area, property deeds, historical records. For days, it was a dead end. Our suburb was built in the late 70s on what was previously unremarkable scrubland. The breakthrough came from a footnote in a dry, academic book about Melbourne's early scientific institutions. It mentioned the Finch Observatory, a privately funded observatory that had stood on a small hill somewhere in the eastern suburbs until it burned down in a mysterious fire in 1928. Its founder, a Dr. Alastair Finch, was described as a brilliant but eccentric astronomer who became obsessed with paracausal light spectra and non-Euclidean celestial mechanics. The academic consensus was that he was a crank. I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I cross-referenced the book's vague description of the location with older survey maps. After 3 hours of painstaking work, I found it. The hill where the Finch Observatory once stood was leveled in the 1970s. At its heart, where the main telescope dome would have been, was a small, perfectly circular street. Jacaranda Close. I wasn't just living in a suburb. I was living on the ruins of a madman's laboratory. This discovery should have felt like a victory, but it only deepened my dread. It gave the phenomenon a history, a name. This wasn't random. It felt like a plan, set in motion almost a century ago. I confided in the only person who seemed willing to listen without judgment, the archivist at the library, a woman named Anika. She was sharp. With intelligent eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of the library's hidden corners. She was the one who had helped me find the book on observatories. Dr. Alastair Finch, I said, laying my printouts on her desk. He was here. Right where my house is. Anika looked at my notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. Finch. I know that name. They said the fire was arson, but no one was ever charged. Most of his papers were thought to be destroyed. Most? The word snagged in my throat. There were whispers. That his family saved one of his journals. That it was donated to the state archives years ago but was never catalogued because it was considered the ravings of a lunatic. She made a few calls. An hour later, She came back with a grim look on her face. It's there. In deep storage. But it's a restricted item. You'd need an academic reason to view it. I have a reason, I said, my voice low and urgent. My whole street is living in one of his experiments. Anika looked at me, her gaze searching my face. I expected to see pity, the same look Chloe gave me. Instead, I saw a flicker of intense curiosity. She believed me. Or, at least, she believed that I believed. That was enough. Let me see what I can do, she said. That week, as I waited for Anika's call, the wrongness at home escalated. It was no longer confined to the shadows or the furniture. It was in Chloe. She started humming. It was a simple, three-note melody, tuneless and repetitive. She did it unconsciously while cooking, while reading, while watching TV. One evening, as the violet light filled the room, I realized the humming had a strange resonance with it. It wasn't a tune, it was a frequency. It felt like she was harmonizing with the light. One afternoon, I came home early and found a glass of water on the living room floor. Not knocked over. Placed carefully in the center of the room. Chloe. I called out. What's with the glass? She came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a tea towel. Oh. It's for the light. It likes it there. She said it so casually, as if she were talking about watering a plant. The light likes it there. I repeated, my blood running cold. She just smiled, a serene, placid smile that didn't reach her eyes. It makes the room feel right. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw that the person I loved was drifting away from me, pulled by a silent, violet tide. The humming, the misplaced objects, the placid acceptance, they were all symptoms. The contagion had breached my walls. It was in my home. The horror was no longer just a spectacle to be observed through a window, I was living inside it. And I was more alone than ever. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Anika came through. She'd pulled strings, called in favors, and presented my request as research for a paper on the psychological impact of historical sites on suburban planning. It was flimsy, but it worked. A week later, I found myself in a sterile viewing room at the State Archives, a single, leather-bound journal on the table in front of me. The personal log of Dr. Alastair Finch. 1925 to 1928. The book smelled of smoke and time. The first several pages were standard astronomical observations, nebular classifications, stellar parallax measurements. But then the entries began to change. The handwriting grew more frantic, the language more esoteric. Finch wasn't just observing the stars, he was trying to listen to them. January 12, 1926, the spectrum is incomplete. We see only the barest sliver of reality's light. Between the known bands, radio, infrared, visible, ultraviolet, there are gaps. Not voids, but dimensions. Other modes of existence, vibrating at frequencies we are not built to perceive. But what if we could build an eye to see them? My hands trembled as I turned the page. He wrote about something he called photonic resonance. His theory was that light wasn't just energy, it was a medium. And like any medium, it could be made to vibrate at a harmonic frequency. If you could generate a precise, unknown frequency of light, paracausal frequency, and sustain it, you could turn a location into a tuning fork. A tuning fork that would resonate with a corresponding frequency from elsewhere. May 3, 1927, I have isolated the frequency. On the spectrograph, it manifests as a faint violet. But it is not a color. It is a key. A key that unlocks the door not between worlds, but between geometries. When the resonance is achieved, our rigid, Euclidean space becomes permeable. It allows for the brief, bleed-through imposition of another spatial logic. A logic where shadows curve, where distance is fluid, where straight lines bend. I had to stop reading. My heart was a drum against my ribs. A logic where shadows curve. He had predicted it. He had designed it. This wasn't an accident. Jacaranda Close wasn't haunted, it was engineered. Finch hadn't just built an observatory. He had built an antenna. A beacon. A welcome mat for another reality. The final entries were terrifying. September 19, 1928, the generator is complete. A crystalline lattice suspended in an argon matrix, powered by the city's own electrical grid. A simple switch is all it will take. I will not simply see the other side. I will invite it to cast its shadow upon our own. This is not invasion. It is integration. A quiet, peaceful merging of what is with what could be. September 24, 1928, they do not understand. They call me mad. They threaten to take my work, my observatory. The fools. They think the fire will stop it. The fire will only release it. The resonance is baked into the very soil now. The seed is planted. It only needs the right stimulus, the right light, to once again bloom. The last page was a complex geometric diagram. It looked like a circuit board, a mandala, and a map all in one. At its center was a perfect circle. My street. I left the archives in a daze. The violet light of the streetlights wasn't Finch's original machine. It was just the stimulus. The new, energy-efficient LEDs, with their specific frequency output, had accidentally stumbled upon Finch's key. They had switched his antenna back on after 90 years of dormancy. I tried to call Anika to tell her, but she didn't pick up. I went to the library. She was at her desk, but she wasn't working. She was staring at one of the photocopies I had left with her, the page with Finch's geometric diagram. With a fine-tipped pen, she was tracing its lines, over and over, her lips slightly parted, a low, tuneless hum escaping her throat. It was the same three-note melody Chloe hummed. "Anika?" I said. She didn't look up. "It's so elegant," she murmured. "The pattern. It makes sense of the noise." My one ally was gone. She was being absorbed, just like my neighbors, just like Chloe. The knowledge I had uncovered hadn't armed me, it had simply provided a vocabulary for my own horror. The escalation in Jacaranda Close was no longer subtle. The alignments had become more overt, more ritualistic. One evening, I saw Mr. Patel standing in the middle of his lawn, his arms held out at a strange angle. He wasn't moving. He was just positioned. His body was a piece of furniture, arranged to suit the impossible shadows. His face, illuminated by the violet glow, was utterly serene, devoid of thought or worry. He was a statue in a garden of encroaching madness. My own personal horror, my shadow, was becoming more defined, more willful. It no longer just twitched or mimicked actions. It started to lead. As I walked to my front door, my shadow would stretch and point towards the center of the cul-de-sac. When I sat in the living room, my shadow on the wall would detach itself from my outline, drifting towards the window, beckoning me to look outside. One night, I woke up to find Chloe gone from the bed. I panicked, my mind racing. I found her in the kitchen. She had taken every glass, cup, and bowl from the cupboards and was arranging them on the floor in a complex spiral. "Chloe, what are you doing? It's 3 in the morning." She turned to me, and her eyes were not her own. They were placid, vacant. "The pattern isn't complete," she said, her voice a monotone. "There is a space. For the resonance." She gestured to an empty spot on the floor. It was my spot. The spot where I usually stood to make coffee in the morning. I backed away slowly. I'm going back to bed. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark of my bedroom, listening to the soft clinking of ceramic on tile as my wife worked to complete a circuit I couldn't understand, for a purpose I couldn't fathom. The contagion wasn't a loss of self. It was a replacement of it. A new, quieter, more orderly self was being imprinted upon them, a self that understood the violet light and the curved shadows. The stakes were no longer about understanding the phenomenon. They were about survival. It was clear now that this wasn't going to stop. The integration Finch wrote about was happening. People weren't going crazy, they were adapting to a new set of physical laws. I was the one who was out of sync. I was the anomaly. My sanity, my resistance, was a bug in the new system. And my shadow, the piece of the new world tethered to my very being, was getting impatient. It wanted me to stop fighting. It wanted me to join in. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The final night came without warning. There was no storm, no dramatic crescendo. Just a deeper silence, a more profound shade of violet. I hadn't slept in what felt like days. I sat in my study, Finch's journal open before me, the diagram of the cul-de-sac staring up at me like a malevolent eye. A compulsion, a cold, clear thought that was not my own, loomed in my mind: you must see it from above. I don't know why I obeyed. Perhaps a part of me had already surrendered. I fetched the aluminium ladder from the garage, the metallic rungs cold beneath my hands. The air outside was thick and still, humming with that silent, violet energy. No one was out, but every house had its lights on, every window a purple square. I propped the ladder against the side of the house and began to climb. My movements felt strangely fluid, effortless. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but it was overlaid with a sense of inevitability. I was climbing towards a revelation I already knew in my bones. When I reached the peak of the roof and hauled myself onto the tiles, I saw it. My breath caught in my chest. From this vantage point, the truth of Jacaranda Close was laid bare. It wasn't a random collection of rearranged furniture and oddly placed garden gnomes. It was one, single, massive work of art. Or science. Or magic. Every object on every lawn was a component. The Patels' wave-like chairs, Mrs. Gable's fence paintings, Sarah's standing stone posture, the spiral of glassware on my own kitchen floor, they were all nodes in a vast, intricate pattern. It was Finch's diagram, brought to life. A colossal lens, or a sigil, etched into the fabric of the suburb, using the mundane artifacts of suburban life as its ink. It was focused on the streetlights, drawing their violet energy, channeling it, amplifying it. The entire cul-de-sac was the tuning fork. I scanned the tableau, my architect's mind instinctively tracing the lines of force, the vectors of intent. I saw the empty spaces, the gaps in the pattern waiting to be filled. Then I looked down at my own lawn. Chloe was there. She had moved my favorite reading chair, a worn leather armchair, into the center of the grass. She was sitting in it, perfectly still, her head tilted back, her face aimed towards the violet sky. She was as serene as a saint in a Renaissance painting. She was another piece of the diagram, perfectly positioned, perfectly aligned. A shadow cast by the house's eave, a shadow that should have been miles away from her, curved impossibly across the lawn to touch the leg of her chair, locking her into the grand design. I looked at my own shadow, cast on the terracotta tiles of the roof beside me. It was no longer a vague silhouette. It was sharp, distinct, a being of pure, unadulterated darkness. It was not my shadow anymore. It was its own creature, and I was merely the object casting it. It moved. It detached itself from my feet, flowed like ink across the tiles, and pointed. It pointed down to my lawn, to a specific, empty patch of grass right beside Chloe's chair. A space designated for me. The invitation was clear. It was a summons. All I had to do was climb down, walk to that spot, and stand there. The struggle would be over. The confusion, the fear, the terrible isolation, it would all melt away, replaced by the serene, placid certainty that I saw on Chloe's face, on Mr. Patel's face. I would understand the humming. I would appreciate the beauty of the curved shadows. I would become part of the pattern. I would be home. My shadow on the roof stretched further, becoming impossibly long, its pointing finger insistent. Join us. Be complete. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Chloe and I, years ago, on our first date, laughing so hard we could barely breathe. The chaotic, messy, imperfect light of that memory was so much brighter than the perfect, orderly violet that surrounded me now. That was the choice. To become a perfect part of an alien whole, or to hold on to the flawed, chaotic memory of being human. I chose chaos. I scrambled backwards, away from the pointing shadow. It recoiled, as if stung. I half fell, half slid down the other side of the roof, landing hard in the soft garden bed of my backyard. I didn't look back. I crashed through the side gate, fumbled for my car keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I jumped into the car, the engine roaring to life with a vulgar, beautiful noise that shattered the violet silence. I sped out of Jacaranda Close, my tires screeching. In the rearview mirror, I saw the street, a perfect circle of purple light, a beacon for something I would never understand. I saw my house. I saw the empty patch of grass beside the armchair. A space in the pattern, forever unfilled. A flaw in the grand design. Me. Underscore 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 underscore. 6 months later. I live in a concrete box on the 27th floor of an apartment building in Perth. I work remotely. I don't own a car. I only go out in the brightest hours of the day. My windows have blackout blinds, and I never, ever look at them after sunset. I've told no one. Who would I tell? How would I even begin? I live in a self-imposed prison of white light and predictable geometry. I am safe. I am sane. But I am haunted. Every shadow seems to hold a latent wrongness. I see patterns in the cracks of the pavement, in the arrangement of scaffolding on a building site. Finch's ghost is everywhere. Most nights, I am fine. But sometimes, when I lie awake in the artificial light of my apartment, I can feel it. A subtle vibration in the bones of the building. A quiet hum, just on the edge of hearing. Tonight, I had to work late. I walked home from the train station, my head down, my pace quick. It was late, the streets mostly empty. And then I made a mistake. I looked up. Across the street, a solitary streetlight flickered. Once. Twice. And for a fraction of a second, in the brief space between the flashes, it glowed with a faint, familiar, impossible violet. My blood turned to ice. I stopped, frozen to the spot. Slowly, terrified of what I would see, I lowered my gaze to the pavement in front of me. To my shadow. It was still, a perfect cutout of a man paralyzed by fear. And then, as I watched, it moved. It raised a single, dark finger, not an admonishment, not an invitation, but as if to say, shh. Be quiet. We're here, too,